It's going to be hard to conquer Europe. So we have no law stating the Mongols have to go back to Mongolia when the Khan dies. We have no evidence that Batu went back to Mongolia when the Khan dies. And it doesn't seem news could even have reached them before the withdrawal began. So a lot of the scholarship now is saying, all right, this is not the reason for the withdrawal. Of course, that sets up the question, what is the reason? It's not, I know I've said this already before, but it's not, conquest of Europe's not going to be easy. Not because I think Europe's great or something. I'm telling you what the Mongols have told us. They think it's going to be hard. Our hypothetical conquest of Europe is not going to be something probably completed in one campaign, if it gets completed at all.
Could the Mongols have conquered Europe? That is the question that has inspired the episode today, which we will somewhat address. In fact, just getting Twitter ready for this episode, I've already just gotten a message saying that it's a silly question. Could the Mongols have conquered thousands of castles, thousands of miles from home? Well, that's a silly question. So there's, of course, lots of back and forth, lots of people who think that the Mongols were quite invincible. And then there are, of course, people who are more on my side. That's my bias, that the Mongols would not have done so well. But we need to get to the facts. We need to understand the real history. And so for today's episode, I have brought on a real Mongol expert who can walk us through Europe and the Mongols' interactions, beginning early in the 1240s, all the way through the 1280s, 1290s, and to discuss what actually happened, and then a little bit of what that may have looked like if the Mongols had decided to try to conquer Europe in full force, let's say, in some sort of theoretical situation. If you're interested at all in the medieval Mongols, you are not going to want to miss this one. And it is well over 2 hours long, a really banging episode, which is sponsored by Cards of History. If you are thinking of what you can get a gift for the history lover in your life this Christmas season, check out Cards of History. You'll find the link to that in the description below. This is episode 22 of Just Feudal Things. We now have well over 20 episodes having conversations with experts and enthusiasts. So as soon as you're finished with this one, if there's some other medieval history that maybe you've been wanting to learn about, feel free to check out the back catalog. And today's episode features Jack Wilson. He's a PhD candidate at the Central European University in Vienna. His current dissertation focuses on the internal disruption of the Golden Horde in the late 13th century, rewriting its political history and seeing how these factors contributed to its invasions of Central Europe in the 1280s. He's also completing his first monograph, Hungary and the Golden Horde, Mongol-Hungarian Military and Political Contacts, 1242 to 1300, to be published with Archeolingua Press, likely in 2026, which gives a summary of these contacts between the Golden Horde and Central Europe after the first Mongol invasion. He's known for his work online on the Mongols, such as his personal YouTube channel, The Jackmeister, Mongol History, and as a regular writer for Kings in General since 2019 for their videos and podcast on the Mongol Empire. You can find him on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under the name Jackmeister as well. And of course, all the links to his work will be in the description. Highly recommend you check him out. He is truly a Mongol expert. After you finish the episode, be sure to let me know what you think if the Mongols could have conquered Europe. And now, without further ado, all right, so maybe we can start by, you can give us a sort of a brief overview of the Mongol way of war, just to sort of set the context for the rest of the conversation. Because I think I mean, prior to seeing your work, for example, on YouTube, I was roughly familiar with horse archers and sort of that method of war, but I didn't know, for example, that the Mongols had some heavy cavalry. So maybe you could talk a little bit about their, their armies a little bit, their method of war, maybe a little bit of their siegecraft skills and stuff like that, and kind of just set the table for the rest of the discussion.
Yes, of course. So obviously, the most famous military unit of the Mongols and all steppe nomadic peoples is a lightly armored or totally unarmored horse archer. This could be seen as just your average nomad will have access to a bow, arrows, and horses, and is being trained in this sort of lifestyle from childhood. So by the time they reach adulthood, these are all very skilled horsemen, very skilled archers. Some of the equipment can be of varying qualities, as a lot of these fellows seem to be making these things themselves, but these are quite experienced individuals. So most of the combat techniques you will see of both the Mongol army of the 13th century, but preceding and succeeding steppe adjacent people, nomadic pastoralists, is going to be based around maximizing this. Now, people tend to get a little bit confused as to the physics of this in the actual battlefield, because they are used to warfare that they see in movies and video games. So everyone has this image of all the warriors sticking their bows straight up into the sky and shooting upwards, and the arrows doing a big arc and then falling amongst the enemy. Or you have these horrible scenes from one of the seasons of Game of Thrones where the Dothraki are squatting on their saddles to shoot at the enemy, and none of that's quite right. What as much as we can reconstruct, what you should expect to see for a Mongol army in the field is the army moving forward in groups of tens, 100. This is how both the society and the army is structured. So this individual group will run towards the enemy and try and shoot straight at the enemy. And again, so not much of a real arc, or you're trying to minimize the arc to that archery, funnily enough. And it seems the ideal range for this is relatively short. I think like 30 meters or something ends up being that sweet spot between getting close enough to the enemy that the arrow has not lost much of its penetrative power, but you can still dart away back from the enemy before they can catch up to you with their own cavalry or something like this. And how this will work is this group will run forward, shoot at the enemy, and then go back and turn around in the saddle and shoot as they're running backwards. So this is your Parthian shots, one of those famous things. And this movement's called a caracal. We have the name actually comes from basically this exact type of technique in European armies of the 17th century or so, in the 30 Years' War or so. Now, I know I've just said that the range is like 30 meters or so. I forget what that is in imperial now. A meter is similar in length to a yard, so it's going to be picture about probably around 100 feet or so, I guess, maybe give or take. So people will come at you with, but we have this record of a arrow going this distance, and we have famously our earliest stone inscription in Mongolian from the 13th century from the Mongol Empire is an inscription celebrating a really long archery shot by a nephew of Chinggis Khan. It's called the Yusunga inscription. It's dated to about 1225, I think. And if you do the conversion on the range they say they shot, it's something like 500 meters or something to that effect, right? That's an insane range. The thing is, when you are shooting an arrow that range, these tend to be with specialty flight arrows. So these are very light arrows designed for being shot very far. And by the time they hit the ground, they've lost a lot of their energy, so will not have a lot of penetrative power. And so if you're shooting at an enemy from long range and he has any sort of armor on him and your arrow's lost most of its penetrative power by the time it hits him, it's not going to be doing as much damage to him. So this kind of idea of the horsemen running up to the enemy, shooting, circling back, and the next group coming up, you're kind of getting a constant barrage of arrows in this way. And part of this maneuver is that it's mentally, for a human being, very hard to just stand there and get shot at. Right? Your instinct is going to be, I got to run away or get out of here. I've been in front of a herd of cattle during cattle branding, and they all ended up running at me at one point. And I had that feeling, like I can still remember it right now, this visual of all the cattle running at me, and in my head going, this is a bad place to be right now. Now imagine at the same time, there's guys on top shooting at you, right? Your instinct's going to be to run away, or you're getting annoyed that your guys are getting hit. So you're going to want to run out and get after the guys shooting at you. Now, this is what the nomadic warrior wants. He wants you to get out of your formation so that he can lure you into a feigned retreat. This is another one of those famous tactics of the Mongols. They want you out of formation, chasing after them, thinking that you've actually chased them off, only to realize you've gotten away from the security of the rest of your army, of your cavalry, and they can now surround you and overwhelm you. Or, as they are shooting at your force and you have guys kind of breaking formation, running away, or they're getting whittled down with arrows, at a certain point, one of these charges is going to be heavy cavalry. Now, heavy cavalry is not what people tend to associate with Mongol or nomadic armies. We actually have a very long history of this. It's not being employed in huge numbers, right? Our evidence for the 13th century Mongol Empire, which probably has a slightly higher percentage of heavily armed troops compared to earlier nomadic armies. We have sources putting this at like 10 to 30% of the army being armored in a significant way. This is normally taking the form of leather laminar armor. So that's leather bands, layers of leather in bands. Kind of imagine the lorica segmentata of the one we associate with Roman armies, those kind of metal bands. Imagine that, but layers of leather. Or they have a metal lamellar armor, which consists of individual metal plates layered over their body. And they're very small, like the size of a thumb, for example. And so these are very flexible armors, and they're designed to be made relatively easily in a steppe environment. The Mongolian plateau and the Altai Mountains, Transbaikalia, actually quite rich in these metals and ores, so they have access to these, and they have small mobile furnaces they can build to melt down these ores. And so you're not making a breastplate. I mean, no one's making breastplates really in the 13th century, but you can make these small little individual pieces that you can tie together. The way heavy cavalry works, in most of it, basically, once you go east of Germany for most of history, heavy cavalry is still basically horse archers, but they are better armored horse archers. So your Mongol heavy cavalry man, he doesn't tend to have face protection, or he might have a sort of laminar bands covering most of his face but his eyes, and he'll leave his hands and underarm kind of exposed so he can still draw a bow effectively. But then when they are being sent to chase against or to charge into the enemy, they can put their bow into a quiver on their belt, and their spears are kept on straps tied to their shoulders, and they can bring those down, and they hold these spears in a double-handed grip off to their side. You'll have a shield on another strap, perhaps covering the left shoulder, and the horse is in some cases armored as well. The evidence for this is a little uneven for the Mongol period. We know this is being done to some extent, but we don't have a percentage specifically for that. So that might just be like the smaller, more elite units of the army, the Khan's Guard, the Keshig, who have that much fine equipment. And this heavy cavalry is kind of going to be only sent in when it is absolutely necessary or for maximum effect, right? Because again, you're not having a huge percentage of this, and you have a lot of ranged warriors who don't have to get very close to the enemy. It is to your advantage to wear down the enemy as much as possible before your bettered armor guys get in close and hopefully rout a demoralized foe who's already had parts of their troops running away to escape this withering fire. Now that is your ideal battlefield Mongol army is looking like that. Now there's a lot of variations to that where they are employing in substantial numbers the peoples they are conquering. So in North China, for example, we know they're employing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Han Chinese, Tongats, these other ethnicities in the region. Most of the conquest of North China and Southern China is completed with this mass mobilization of these sedentary peoples. In the western end of the empire, you see for example, in the wars between the Ilkhanites, so the Mongol Khanate ruling the Middle East, versus the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, we know they're employing lots of Georgians and Armenians, especially in cavalry roles. We know they're using Seljuk armies of the former Seljuk Empire. They are using in Anatolia and Rum. During the invasion of Hungary in 1241, we have references to them using peoples from the recently conquered Rus principalities and Kumin Kipchaks of the steppe in Hungary. And some of these people are traveling very far. So we have references to Tangut, a people from northwestern China, the Gansu corridor, fighting for the Mongols in the Caucasus. And especially people who have specialized roles in the Mongol view. So they'll see, oh, these people, they are very good at heavy cavalry because they just have a culture or a society and economy which produces a lot of that. So we rely a lot on them for heavy cavalry. These people provide us a lot of infantry. Or in the Chinese case, these people are providing us a lot of siege engineers. So very early in the Mongol warfare in northern China, like we're talking by 1213, only 2 years into the war, the Mongols are already fielding large numbers of siege engineers and equipment. Some of them are joining the Mongols willingly at this point, but they're teaching the Mongols how to build ladders, various types of catapults, sapping and undermining walls. And the early Mongol armies, or for most of the 13th century actually, the first technique they're using against cities is a mass, there's a forced levy, they call in Persian hashar, or hasar. And so this is the people from the neighboring villages and towns around a major settlement. The Mongols will send all of these people forward as prisoners towards this major settlement. And their job, literally sent forward at the end of a spear, is to fill in like the moats of a major settlement, to push siege equipment, to carry rocks for the catapults, to absorb the enemy arrows, or to literally be pushed against the gates of the city and with their body mass force these gates open. And the defenders of the town have to make this horrible choice of, do we shoot our own people? Do we let them in and potentially let the Mongols come in? Or if you let all these people into the city, they're going to come in there and overwhelm the resources they brought in to sustain a siege. There's only so many mouths they can feed in a city. They're also bringing with them exaggerated stories of how terrifying the Mongols are, and this is going to demoralize your defenders. And the idea of a lot of these things is to put other people in harm's way and keep your Mongol troops, who are again mostly unarmored horse archers, out of the way. If you're fighting in southern China or the far west of the steppe or in Hungary, it's very hard to get more Mongol troops out to those locations. So you want those losses to be sustained amongst these subject peoples who are going to be taking these really exposed roles in combat situations. And that's more or less as quick an overview of the Mongol army of the 13th century I can give you. It's not just the horse archers overwhelming people. It's a lot of systems, and also a lot of focus on morale and terrifying people. They get a lot of mileage out of people being entirely convinced that if they fight against the Mongols and lose, their settlement, their army will be eradicated, their people enslaved, all of these things. And the reason they believe this is because this is happening a lot. Like, this is a very serious threat. People are believing, and that the Mongols are carrying out on a lot of occasions.
Well, it seems like that's probably reasonable. You'd only have to see it, I guess, one time to believe it, and it seems like they were pretty prolific at it. I just
Yeah.
realized as you were talking a long time ago. I think I read I have it over here, the Jack Weatherford book.
Yes.
Now he makes a claim in that book that I haven't seen anywhere else about the Mongols having this aversion to the smell of their enemies, and how there's this part of their culture is sort of having like a religious I'm just remembering it from reading it a long time ago, but it really stuck with me. This is like one of my big takeaways from the book was that the Mongols had this.
Is it the smell or the bloodshed? The shedding of blood?
I think it was both. That they had an aversion to the blood, which is one of the reasons why they in his book he talks about they would roll people up in carpets and trample them in horses as a method of execution to try to keep it bloodless, and that they preferred this archery method of warfare to basically keep the enemy at a distance because there's like a spiritual component to being able to smell the enemy.
I don't remember the smell, but it's for me. I also Weatherford's book was one of the books I read like when I first began to be interested in them all, because it's if you go to a library, if for those who don't know, if you go to any library to to find a book on the Mongols, Jack Weatherford's book is going to be the one that's there. Now, I want to make it clear here: Jack Weatherford himself is a very nice man. I've emailed with him before. He has a very deep appreciation for Mongolian culture, and but he is an anthropologist first and a historian second. And that book, it's um, it's a very interesting book as a resource for the Mongol Empire. It's not great. I've written a review on this for the medievalists.net where I outline this in more detail, but there's a lot of the material in there is not at academic standard, let's say. So, for example, the thing about the bloodshed, this is something you see in a lot of popular media about the Mongols, or people online talk about this, that they, you know, they consider a mark of respect if they kill you without shedding your blood, and this is somewhat true. So what it is that in the 13th century they're believing that the human body has, I think it's three souls, and one of them is contained in the blood. So when you spill that blood on the ground, especially outside of a combat situation, that person's soul that is located in the blood will be tethered to that spot. And it will be upset about that and can bring misfortune on you. So if you come back to that spot, that soul might try and it'll become an evil spirit essentially, or a malevolent spirit, and bring harm on you and your family, or your state. So even today in Mongolia, when they are harvesting an animal and butchering it and stuff, they will do this without spilling the animal's blood on the ground. They'll put it on a carpet or a blanket or a tarp or something and do all the butchering on there, and not have it spilt. So when people say they're doing this out of sign of respect for the nobles or whatever, they're doing it to people who are elite or nobles, not out of respect in the 13th century, but because they essentially believe if you are nobility, you have a more powerful soul than a common person. Right? In the animism or the Tengriism of the 13th century, these shamanist beliefs, your status in life is what you have in death. So if you are just a peasant or a slave in life, in the next world when you die, you are still the soul of a peasant or a slave. But if you're a really powerful king and you die, your soul is still that of a really powerful king and is a lot more powerful. So if you kill an important person and get their blood everywhere, that's a potentially very powerful and dangerous spirit you've unleashed, and you don't want to bring that evil onto yourself or your people. And we see a lot of the Mongols' prohibitions about these things, and they have a couple others, such as not putting you or stepping on the threshold of their tents. Ger in Mongolian, or what's normally called yurt in a lot of common parlance, in the doorway there's a frame at the bottom, and if you step on that, that's bad luck. If you put a knife or into a fire or urinate in ashes, you will anger the spirits within those things. If you wash dirty things in running water, like a river, in certain times of the year, you will anger the spirits that live in those water. Essentially, everything in the world has these kind of spirits inhabiting them, and you want to appease them as much as possible because it will bring better fortune on you to do that. And this is the same when we end up with the Mongols' alleged religious tolerance. Now, people call it that. It's not like what people picture when they say that is not what we have in the 13th century. They see it as if you have a state and a certain religion, your gods or gods therefore has power because it has granted you some sort of power on the earth. So these certain religious privileges they will give, mostly in the form of exemptions from taxation, exemptions from corvée labor, those sorts of things, are aimed at religious institutions who will in turn pray for the longevity of the Khan and the empire. And so the Rus Church, for example, in what's today Russia, Ukraine, this is very early brought on board to supporting Mongol rule, praying for the long life of the Khan in exchange for exemption from taxations and promises that the people on the church's lands, because the church in Rus is a huge landholder, that the serfs that it has will not be taken away by the Mongols to be forced labor for them. So a lot of the things in the empire are kind of functioning on this sort of viewpoint. Now, back to this issue of religious tolerance, because it's kind of a fun example, is the way the religious tolerance works is you can practice your religion as long as you don't do the things about your religion we don't like. So they ban, at certain points, and this happens a couple times, they ban on pain of death and forfeiture of your property, halal and kosher slaughter. So they still say you can still be a Muslim or a Jew, but we don't want to see you slaughtering animals in public, because in halal slaughter, kosher slaughter, you have to drain the blood. This is the antithesis of what I just explained was the traditional Mongolian way of butchering animals. You don't spill the blood at all. And we have one of our sources, Juvayni, Persian, working in the court of Hulagu Khan in the 1250s. He writes that this was so strictly enforced in what's today Eastern Iran, Central Asia, that for over 10 years, Muslims there ate nothing but carrion off the side of the road. Now, that's obviously an exaggeration to some extent, but we see these prohibitions being enforced several times over the course of the empire. And there seems to have been something of a debate amongst the Mongols themselves about how applicable their customary law, things like these prohibitions about washing dirty things and running water or slaughter, about how applicable these were supposed to be to non-nomadic peoples. And they probably never quite found a happy medium, as some Khans would want to enforce it, some wouldn't. Some would be convinced to enforce it and things like this. So that's kind of my opinion on that. And again, this is applying to outside of the battlefield. We have no indication that concerns about spreading blood were ever affecting tactics. For example, it's very hard to win a battle without spilling someone's blood, unless you're fighting with pillows or something, but I don't believe there's any records of that.
I am also familiar. I read a long time ago, probably around the same time, I think, actually, as I read the Weatherford book. I read another book that was a big biography on Attila the Hun. And one of the things that really struck out to me reading that book was the the way that they fought with these concentric circles of the horse archers, basically, to get that essentially continuous fire of the continuous fire of arrows. And so it seems like the Mongols are kind of doing that, some variation, something kind of similar to that. But it seems to me like the real genius, if you will, of the Mongol war machine is this. I don't know how you want to phrase it. The ability to essentially take all of these other people that they conquer and use them as essentially like the manpower, the initial casualties, filling up the moats and pushing the siege equipment and taking all the heavy damage. That seems to be sort of the, I suppose, key part of their method of war. Is that fair or no?
Well, you do see this with other nomadic people. So, of course, with Attila, if you look at the makeup of his army at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, a lot of that army is Goths and other peoples of his empire, Germanic peoples and things. And this is, nomads have always done this. They've always recognized the not the failings, but the aspects of their army that they are not as effective at. Right? And this is what every army in history, any good army in history does. They recognize what they're good at, what they're not good at, and what they can do to overcome that. The difference, I would say, with the Mongol system is not so much the what specifically is being done in that sense, but more so the scale of it. What the Mongol Empire is very good is doing this at a logistical scale that is an order of magnitude different from what the Huns were capable of. And at the same time, putting this in a specific ideology, that of the belief that Tengri, so eternal blue heaven, has granted the world to be ruled over by the line of Chinggis Khan. So Genghis Khan, as he's normally called in English, or used to be in English, Genghis Khan, until people started doing Genghis for some reason, but Chinggis Khan. Now, again, earlier nomadic states, they have variations of this idea of the heaven-blessed Khan. This is not a new one. This is not something Chinggis Khan comes up with in the year 1206. But the Mongols are very good at convincing people that it's utterly true and that they will push to the ends of the earth for this. So this is comparable to what Alexander the Great does, pushing his troops all the way to the borders of India. That, or comparable to Hannibal pushing his men for 12 years to fight in Italy. That it's not that these are individually unique military systems. All of them are taking advantage of things that had already been established by their predecessors in some way. They're not building new systems, but they're putting a certain leadership, a certain charisma, a certain ideology to it that is convincing people to push themselves to the next limit and be utterly loyal to this. And with the Mongol system, what you will often hear is that, the Mongol Empire breaks up on Chinggis Khan's death. The Mongol Empire stays a totally united entity until 1260, until the death of his grandson, the fifth great Khan, Mönke. And the Mongols, though, continue to recognize the overlordship of the great Khan well into the 14th century, when you still have these Khanites ruling. And you have parts of the world that are still ruled by descendants of Chinggis Khan up until the 18th century with the annexation of the Crimean Khanates by the Russian Empire. You could also include some of these Khanates in Khiva in Central Asia, which aren't dissolved until the 19th century. But by then, that Chinggisid, the Chinggisid lineage by then is not the dominating decision upon which legitimacy is built. For about 400 years, 400 or 500 years after Chinggis Khan's death in 1227, descent from Chinggis Khan remains the primary means of legitimacy for rulers, and they adapt this in places, of course, with Islam or Buddhism, what have you, but it's incorporating this idea that the ruler has to be descendant from Chinggis Khan, or if he's not, the guy who's the de facto head has to pay homage to your de jure head of state, who is a descendant of Chinggis Khan. And this is what the Timurids do in the early Timurid Empire. So that's what I would say on that element, that there's not like one weird trick to help you conquer the world, right? It's kind of a lot of things coming together, or you'll see people do really weird things about this. I've seen people say online, "Oh, Chinggis Khan is the guy who invents horse archery, or he invents stirrups," right? Like people get this idea that, and this is probably like a post World War II thing where war is decided by who has the better technology. That it's just everything is just always an arms race. And this is very rarely the case. This is arguably not even the case for World War II. And of course, the Americans are building a sun they can drop on people by 1945, right? But the nuclear bombs is not what wins World War II. World War II is effectively won by the time the bombs are dropped. And I don't want to get a bunch of emails about that, so I'm not going to go into that. But I'm not a scholar of World War II. But like, there's logistics, there's ideology, there's imperial charisma, there's the ability to recognize your strengths, but also recognize your weaknesses. And I would argue the successes of the early Mongol Empire, and by early, I'm going to say the period from 1206 to about 1270, they're continually victorious in just about everywhere they fight, with some exceptions, which we might get into later. But a lot of these victories are because they have a very realistic ability to assess what they can and can't do, or at least the political will to keep pushing and pushing and pushing until you overcome that. And I would say, what is your hallmark of a lot of these defeats in the late 13th century, early 14th century? So I'm thinking in particular of the failed Yuan invasions in Southeast Asia, Japan. A lot of these, in my opinion, are failures. Obviously, this is harsher geography for horse archers to fight in, but as I said, a lot of these armies are not horse archers anymore. They're putting a lot of local peoples into these fights. A lot of the armies, that the people who die in the failed invasions of Japan or Vietnam or Java are Han Chinese or other ethnicities in southern China fighting for the Mongols. A lot of the failures here are because they're not really accurately assessing what they should or shouldn't be doing, and don't have the political will to overcome that. And what is happening in Europe, to bring our discussion back towards Europe, in my research, and my research right now is focusing a lot on these later 13th century Mongol attacks on Europe, we do not see the political will or capability to assemble a type of army necessary for completing a conquest of Europe. And that is more singularly influential than just, it is this one simple the Europeans had this type of sword and the Mongols couldn't deal with it, so therefore they can't conquer Europe, right? Like, everyone wants to find one. It'd be great if history was just easily explained by these one weird tricks. It would make my life a little bit easier, but it's not.
I love that meme. He conquered the world. This one trick. Everybody hates him.
Doctors hate him.
Yeah.
But I think it's because we naturally don't like complexity, and you think your average person, they're not historians. They're not dealing with history very much. They have jobs, lives, they're not expected to go through primary sources and stuff. So for them, going about their lives, it's a lot more convenient if it's just, X reason did this. Or if I'm trying to make a YouTube video that goes really viral, or something that goes viral, I'll say, because it rained a lot in the early 13th century, the Mongols conquered the world. Or, the Mongols had gunpowder, therefore they conquered the world. The Mongols, and this is something we can also talk about too at some point perhaps, the Mongols do have access to gunpowder, but the way they're using it is not very similar to how we're picturing at the time, because the technology isn't quite there yet. So it cannot be the one weird trick, because most of what gunpowder is doing in the 13th century is throwing off a lot of smoke and noise. And that's what gunpowder is doing for the next 2 centuries or so until you refine it enough and build strong enough cannons and handguns and things like this to make it an actually lethal projectile. And of course, once we do that, we upend the whole. It does become a one weird trick thing, perhaps, but it's right. Like people, you say gunpowder, people are picturing cannons, and they do seem to have something you can perhaps call a cannon in the 13th century. It's probably more of a handgun type of thing, but it's not going through castle walls at this point. Let's put it like that.
So my last question before we get started with maybe the 1241 invasion is you had mentioned at the very beginning about how the Mongols are this nomadic, their fundamental piece is this nomadic horse archer. When I think about comparing this to medieval Europe, and I'm just going to explain it very briefly for the sake of brevity, it seems that there's like a very clear caste system in medieval Europe. You obviously have the nobility or these other sort of landed knights and so forth who essentially spend their whole lives training. And then you have obviously whatever peasants, serfs, tradesmen, and various people sort of mostly stay within their caste, within their profession. How does that work with the nomadic? Is there with the nomadic tribes? Is that like a caste system where they have somebody who specifically trains, or is it more of a everyone's sort of a yeoman archer?
Yeah. So this is one of these really interesting areas of research that is going on right now. So when we say tribe, people tend to get this stereotype in their heads that this is these pre-state egalitarian societies where everyone's about the same social rank. You might have a chief or a few big men, but other than that, everyone's just kind of a herder and he's got his animals and stuff. And what the more recent research has really emphasized is these are not tribal in this sort of sense. These are not societies organized around kinship and lineage. These are organized in essence around these what we can call decimal systems. So everyone's heard this around the Mongol armies organized in the units of 10,000, 1,000, 100, and 10. So this is a very old form of organization in the steppe, going back to the Hunnu, the Xiongnu. You might see them written as so well over 1,000 years before Chinggis Khan. So what these you could perhaps think of these as is not 10,000 men on a battlefield, but a group of households organized into a unit of 10,000 for tax purposes. And they are assigned a region in the steppe that they live in and pastures they migrate between, who are expected to raise 10,000 men for battle. So that's and of course, I'm rounding on these numbers. The reality is it's not going to be exactly 10,000 or whatever. So this group of households is expected to raise however many amount of men for the battle and supply them with their horses and bows and arrows and whatnot. And you have there's a leadership within these units, but each of these units is in turn assigned to the lords and commanders of the state. And these become your lineages that you read about. So you have in the Mongol Empire sort of a 3 distinct kind of hierarchy at the minimum. So you have what's called in Mongolian the Altan Uruk, so your golden lineage. So this is Chinggis Khan and his descendants. Then you have your the white bone lineage. So this is the existing steppe aristocracy. So the people who are already noble of the upper class but aren't descendants of Chinggis Khan. And they are part of what becomes in the 13th century the Harchu. So your black-boned or black-headed people. So this is the military aristocracy. So these are the people who, especially at the start of the conquest, they tended to come from the lower members of the steppe nobility and were raised to become really important because one of their ancestors helped Chinggis Khan on XYZ or did this such and such a feat, or showed themselves very loyal, or were part of the Keshig, the imperial bodyguard, and were rewarded with lands or peoples to pay them. And these are in the Mongol Empire, these things are always hereditary, and this seems to be a very ancient custom in the steppe. And this is usually how a lot of titles work in a lot of human societies before the modern period. Anyways, part of the reward for these positions is they tend to be hereditary, right? So you have these hereditary elites, and then you have your common herders, and you have wealthier individuals, and you have herders who they are barely even herders because they don't have enough animals to actually support themselves. So part of their rent, we could say, is paid by working the herds of the richer members or the nobility in some manner. So it's we rather than this kind of egalitarian kinship-based tribal situation, it is kind of much more feudal. And one of the arguments that has been made is the Huns are bringing feudalism to Europe in the 5th century. I'm not on top of that. I know this is an argument that is made. I'm not really familiar with the specifics, but the argument is that your classic steppe organization mirrors actually the ideal of European feudalism very well. And I don't want to get into all that because that's far too much for what we have time for today. But I want to make people think that this is not just a lot of independent herders being convinced to fight for Chinggis Khan. These are lords and subjects. Now, there is a degree of social mobility within this, right? We have cases where people who are bondsmen to another lord show some sort of loyalty or feat to Chinggis Khan and are rewarded, and their family become great lords because of this. Or you have a guy who's just kind of a regular warrior, and he does a impressive feat on the battlefield, and he gets advanced to a commander of 100 men rather than 10. Or you see these commanders of, say, 100, they have to send a younger brother or son to the imperial bodyguard, the Keshig, as a hostage, essentially. And a lot of these people who start out as hostages around the Khan, and that's what the one of the main positions in the Keshig is called the Turkakut, so the day guard. This becomes synonymous with the word for hostage in Mongolia and some other languages in Asia in the centuries after the Mongol Empire, Turkat. So guys who start out in these positions, they are basically indoctrinated through loyalty to the Khan, fighting alongside him, getting rewarded. They're learning how to be officers, how to be generals. So the Keshig is often compared to the German general staff of the early 20th century, for example, where these guys aren't just guards, they're also the household and administration of the Khan and the empire, but they're also learning how to be commanders and governors and can be assigned to different regions on the Khan's behalf. And a lot of your very famous people in early Mongol history start off in these hostage positions. So the most famous of all of them is Subukatai, more commonly called in English Subutai, the famous general who leads the Mongol armies into Europe in 1241. And his family becomes a hereditary aristocracy because of that. And it seems his family had been kind of bondsmen to Chinggis Khan for a couple generations, but it's said that in 1203, according to his official biography in the Yunshe, that Subadai's father was just a sheep herder, and he was bringing sheep to Chinggis Khan in one of his low moments, and he was attacked by bandits, and then Subadai and his older brother rescue their father and get the sheep to Chinggis Khan, and because of this, they are richly rewarded and becomes one of the most famous generals in history because of this. So the society is more stratified than people expect, but there's room to grow if you show ability, or importantly, show loyalty. And if you have ability and loyalty, well, the sky's the limit, baby.
All right, so maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about the 1241 invasion. Is that the first contact between not first contact, but let's say first substantial interaction between the Mongols and Europe?
Yeah. So this is another very interesting thing. Europe has been hearing about the Mongols for about 2 decades by the time they first invaded Hungary in 1241. They hear sort of vague rumors of it during the, oh goodness, what is it, the Seventh Crusade, when they're in Egypt in 1218 or so. I'm forgetting here. The one where they take Damietta and they try and march on Cairo and they fail. I'm getting the exact number of the crusade and the year mixed up, but it's one of those ones. And they hear vague rumors of Prester John in the east. So this non-Muslim king who they think is a Christian who's going to come and conquer all of the Muslims and restore the Holy Land back to the Christians, to Europe. And what they hear is this non-Muslim king who's conquering this powerful Islamic empire in the east, and it is essentially a version of the rumor of what was actually happening was Chinggis Khan's conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, 1219 to 1223. So they hear a kind of bastardized version of this. You have the Queen of Georgia, Rusudan, I believe her name is. She sends a letter to the Pope around this time saying she cannot send troops for the crusade because of the threat of the Mongols in Georgia in the early 1220s. This is Jebe and Subadai, their operations there. And then you have the famous battle on the Kalka River. So today, what is now eastern Ukraine, where a Mongol force defeats Mongol force under Subadai. He's going to be coming up a lot today. Defeats a coalition of Kipchak, so Turkic nomads, and Rus princes. And rumors of this spread across Europe. We have reports of it in Latvia, for example. And that is the kind of, you have this flash of rumors essentially in the early 1220s. Nothing for a few years. And then 1235, I think it is, you have a Hungarian Dominican, Friar Julian. He's going off to find the homeland of the Hungarians in the east. So he ends up going to, let's say, Bashkortostan, finding the Bashkirs, though today the Bashkirs speak Turkic language. They adopt Turkic languages and Islam after the Mongol conquest. Prior to that, they are speaking a language that is still mutually intelligible with Hungarian. And Friar Julian goes there literally on the eve of the Mongol invasion, and he brings back rumors of, oh, there's this huge army on the east, and it's conquering the Eastern Hungarians, and he's conquering the Volga Bulgars, and he tries going to the Northern Rus princes again. He ends up meeting a envoy from the Mongols who bring with him a letter that he takes back to the king of Hungary, Bela IV. And this is a letter which famously says, who are you living in stone houses that think you can flee our grasp? But one of the interesting things that we get mentioned in a few sources, for example, in these Mongol letters that are reported to us that are sent to the king, they say that we have been sending you all of these envoys and you aren't responding to them. And one of our Hungarians, I don't actually remember if he's ethnically Hungarian, but he's in the Kingdom of Hungary when the Mongols invade in 1241. His name is, I think it's Master Roger, I believe. So he's a guy in the church. And he writes that the Hungarians had been hearing so many rumors the Mongols were about to invade for years and years and years that when they actually came, at first they thought it was a joke. Turns out it wasn't a joke, and they paid quite dearly for that. But Bela IV, he seems to be kind of aware of what's going on. Now, he gets kind of a bad reputation. He's kind of blamed that he was just like sitting on his hands when the Mongols showed up. But he seems to have been informed through these envoys, through fleeing Rus princes coming into Hungary to escape the Mongols. So as the Mongols approach his borders in the Carpathians, he has his men build a bunch of wooden barricades over the passes through the Carpathian Mountains. Unfortunately for Bela, the Mongols have brought a whole bunch of guys dedicated for things like this, and they cut through these huge wooden barricades in like a day or two. One of the sources says they put something to like 40,000 men to the task of cutting through them. The number is probably an exaggeration, but this should kind of give the idea of just like thousands of men with axes going up against poorly manned fortifications in the mountains. And I want to emphasize that because we'll come back to that later when we talk about 1285. And then, of course, the Mongols crossed the Carpathians and unleashed just a swath of devastation on Hungary in 1241, as well as Poland and southern Europe. So they greatly destabilize Bulgaria, go through Serbia. They might have a clash with the Latin Empire of Constantinople, according to some sources. And as probably I'd imagine most people here are vaguely aware, it goes very badly for the Hungarians in 1245. Whatever they had heard about for rumors for the Mongols, the practical preparations were simply insufficient. Now, one of the very interesting things that has come to light in recent years, and we only know this from archaeology, we have no written sources about this, or not dealing with it directly. But one of the things we have found in connection with the Mongol invasion in the Great Hungarian Plain, so the central part of Hungary is this nice rolling steppe land, grassland. And we find the remains of these fortified churches. So what it was in the Hungarian Plain was usually the only stone buildings within the plain were the churches. And they would be in the middle of these graveyards. But what we find is a lot of these churches are surrounded with ditches dug around them. And there's usually 2, sometimes 3 or more concentric ditches running around them. And they would have been topped with some sort of wooden, like small, short wooden wall. And some of these ditches were dug very hastily and quickly, going even through the graves of individuals. Now, very common in human society, you don't like to disturb the graves of your own people. So this is some intense emergency which is happening in 1241 that caused people to do this. And it seems this is more or less the local people trying to build defenses for themselves against the Mongol attack. Why this is interesting, though, is we find quite a number of them. I don't remember the exact number right now, but there's it's kind of a surprising amount, and there's probably going to be more found in the coming years as we continue to do archaeology in Hungary. Now, you could dig these relatively quickly if you have a decent team of men, but the Kingdom of Hungary, it's a pretty big space. So these messages had to go out pretty quickly and thoroughly to get these number of fortifications built across the entirety of the Hungarian plain. So what maybe has happened here is this is even before the Mongols have crossed over the mountains. These kind of warnings are being sent out to make people prepare. Unfortunately for the people preparing them, all of these were utterly insufficient. Every single one of these defenses that has been found has been essentially filled up with bodies and like mauled human remains. Some of them still have arrowheads buried in them. Lots of them seem to simply have never been recovered. Like the people in them were never actually given a burial. They were just left there to rot because the area was so thoroughly depopulated. Nobody ever came around to bury them or to inter them. So this is about the extent of your early warning for the Europe, but in particular the Hungarians regarding the Mongol invasion. It seems like none of the rest of the European powers took this seriously at all. We know that the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II is receiving envoys from the Mongols as early as I think 1237, and they give him an offer to join us, and we'll give you your pick of whatever you want to be in the empire, your pick of Europe. And Frederick, according to the Chronicle of Alberic de Trois-Fontaines, he says, Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick says something along the lines of, I'm not fit to be more than a falconer, because he really loved falconing, and that was, I guess, kind of his dream job. And he gives kind of a smarmy answer because that was his character at the time. So that you do have more. The Europeans know a bit more about the Mongols coming into 1241, and people often kind of portray it as, but not enough to really be useful for them in a battlefield sense.
So I'm sure you've encountered the meme. Maybe it's a meme, I guess. I know I get it every time I've posted about the Mongols, where people say, well, they would have kept going if not for Ogedai's death. They turned around because of Ogedai's death, but apparently there's some new research on that suggesting that that is not the case. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
No, so this is an argument that's been proposed by a colleague of mine, Dr. Stephen Powell. And first of all, doubts about the theory of Ergadai's death causing the withdrawal have been in place for decades, right? We have a couple issues with it. We have one source that makes this connection, and that's John de Plano Carpini, a Franciscan friar who comes to the Mongol court in 1246 after the invasion, and he makes this connection. We have other sources, though, like Rashid ad-Din, a guy working for the Mongols, and he is working off of some sort of Mongolian report of the invasion in 1300 or so. And he writes that the withdrawal begins before they even learned of his death. But Stephen Powell he's gone very thoroughly through this, and he's pointed out that, well, there's a number of issues with this. First of all, Ergadai dies 11th of December 1241. And he's kind of a bit more of a rural palace in Mongolia, so he's not in the capital of Karakorum. He's at one of these palace structures that he builds throughout Western Mongolia that he likes to spend a couple weeks at as he does his migration routes around Western Mongolia and drinks, or Central Mongolia and drinks. And he dies at one of these in kind of an out-of-the-way spot. And so this is 11th December 1241. We know that the withdrawal is beginning around March, April 1242. So that's giving you, if the messenger leaves immediately upon the discovery of Ergadai's body, somewhere in the area of 3 months to get to Batu in Hungary, before Batu starts to leave at the end of it. We don't know the exact day. We kind of only know the period that it's around late March, early April, right? And this is a very narrow time span to cross the entirety of Asia in the middle of winter. We have a few references to the length of time it took to make those journeys. We don't have a guy doing that exact trip again from Mongolia to Hungary, and then someone saying, "Oh, it took X amount of days." But we have lots of references to people doing like the trip from what's today Ukraine to Mongolia, or from what's today Beijing to the Volga River, for example. And we're looking at the area of it's closer to 200 days to do that trip. I forget the exact number right now. Stephen has a chart on this. He has a new book coming out on this, hopefully in the next couple weeks, that outlines this more thoroughly, Conquest and Withdrawal, with Archeolingua Press. I'm hoping comes out before the end of this year. If you're kind of curious in that, I've done videos on my personal channel, the Jackmeister Mongol History, some interviews with Stephen where we discussed this in more detail. But the information we do have suggests, even for the Mongols, in the middle of winter, this is too narrow a time span to get there before Batu leaves. And there's a lot of reason to assume the messengers wouldn't have left anyways. Ergadai's widow, Torergene Hatun, she becomes the regent, and we know she wants her son, Guyuk, to succeed Ergadai. Ergadai has a lot of kids. He seems he likes all of them more than Guyuk, and there's a lot of other potential candidates for the throne. So for Torergene, she already knows, or I think, but we know Guyuk, he leaves the army early in 1240, so before they even go into Hungary, right? So he's already on his way back to Mongolia. So for the people in Mongolia, his faction, there's not a lot of incentive to have the whole rest of the army and princes come running back to Mongolia. Moreover, the army and the princes never come back to Mongolia. So Batu, the sort of the main prince of the army, he only goes as far east as the Volga River and he stays there. In around 1248, he goes a little further east to eastern Kazakhstan, but he never returns to Mongolia proper. Most of the army is staying with Batu at least until 1244, 1245, and some of them end up going to Mongolia in 1246 for the coronation of Guyuk Khan. But Batu is not running back to Mongolia in 1242. The information we have from our eyewitness, Master Roger, indicates that when the Mongols leave or start to leave Hungary, they're doing so very slowly, and they're being very thorough and methodically going over all the places they didn't sack in the first pass over the kingdom. Right? So they're not rushing to get out of there. And now you'll sometimes see people say, oh, the Mongols have a law that says the Khan dies, everyone's got to come running back. This does not exist. We have cases of people returning to Mongolia, usually to return the body of the Khan who just died, or because they want to be the next Khan and they want to be there, or something to that effect. And we do see them reduce campaigning during these years, but they don't stop campaigning during these years either. A good example is 1259, when Mönke Khan, the grandson of Chinggis, he dies on campaign in southern China. So the army with his body, which has his son in it, takes his body all the way back to Mongolia for burial on Mount Burhan Khaldun in northeastern Mongolia. His brother Hubelai, though, continues campaigning well into 1260 before he comes back to the steppe, declare himself Khan. And he doesn't even go back to Karakorum for that. Now, they have another brother, Hulagu. So this is the guy who conquers Baghdad in 1258. And he invades Syria in 1259. And he withdraws. And you'll sometimes see, even historians write this, that Hulagu has to go back to Mongolia because of the succession. But Hulagu doesn't do that. He only goes back to what is today Azerbaijan, and he stays in the pastures there and more or less spends the rest of his life in that area. If you're trying to keep an eye on what is happening in Mongolia, Azerbaijan is not much more convenient than northern Syria, right? So it seems in this case, Hulagu's left Syria, and he says this himself in a letter to King Louis IX in 1262. He's leaving Syria on account of there being insufficient pasturage for his army, and he wants to avoid the summer heat in Syria anyways. And the Mongols also think that Egypt is going to be a walk in the park for them, so they're happy to put the campaign off until the winter of 1260 to come in there and take Cairo. What ends up happening, of course, is the Mamluks are in Egypt. They've taken power, and they strike out first and defeat that small Mongol garrison that's left behind in Syria and Palestine, and they defeat them at the Battle of Ain Jalut in September 1260, because this is just a small holding force left behind while Hulagu is off spending the summer in the cooler mountain ranges in the Caucasus. So we have no law stating the Mongols have to go back to Mongolia when the Khan dies. We have no evidence that Batu went back to Mongolia when the Khan dies, and it doesn't seem news could even have reached them before the withdrawal began. So a lot of the scholarship now is saying, all right, this is not the reason for the withdrawal. Of course, that sets up the question, what is the reason? Now, Stephen Powell's, he goes through this a lot more thoroughly in his book, so I won't go into great length here. People have tried to blame it on the weather that was very wet in Hungary in 1241, and we get this from the dendrochronology or dendrochronological data and some of this the data you can infer from the plant life and stuff that you can see registered that it was a wet spring in Hungary in 1242, but no sources are complaining about this, so we don't really have reason to assume that's why. We've seen people say that, there was not enough pasture in Hungary for the whole Mongol army, and the guy who made this argument is a Hungarian scholar by the name of Denis Sajnor, and Stephen has a nice table of this where he shows how basically Shinor's math kept changing about how many Mongols there were, how many horses they had, how much pasturage was available in Hungary and how many animals that could provide for. And he kept changing this over like 30 years. So he would just keep ending up with, no, it was insufficient for the Mongols. It doesn't seem to have been a factor. Probably they wouldn't have cared. They campaigned in much more desert-like regions compared to Hungary. Hungary's often compared medieval sources kind of this paradise in a way in terms of how good quality the grassland is there. So what you kind of end up with through process of elimination is that, well, there was military reasons for the withdrawal in 1242. Now, of course, important caveat here, when we talk about the military cause for the withdrawal, you'll see all sorts of people online go, oh, he's good Christian soldiers, his wonderful heavy cavalry and castles and stuff in Hungary. This causes the Mongols to give up in 1241. Now, there's reason to think castles, for example, heavy cavalry, these are factors in it, right? But I would argue the main reason is by the time we get to this stage, Batu and Subadai's army has been on campaign for 6 years continuously. Their army probably starts around 100,000 men, and by the time they're getting into Hungary, they're sitting around 60,000 men. We know a significant portion of the army leaves them in 1240 to go back to Mongolia under Guyuk and Wenke. They've sustained losses through basically all the battles they fought. Guys are injured, guys are tired. We know the princes in the army. There's a lot of Mongol princes on this army, and they're all basically at each other's throat by the end of it. They all kind of hate each other. They're all upset. Batu seems to be the one getting all the nice pieces of the pie out of this. And this is a force that it's been encountering a lot of friction. So in popular portrayals, these campaigns are very easy for the Mongols, and it's that a Mongol shows up and they burn 1,000 cities, and they're sore arms tired from all the guys they've killed, and just a bunch of excessive superhuman claims. But I'm sorry to burst people's bubbles. The Mongols are humans. Humans wear out, but also these battles are difficult. Right? The Mongols are winning all the battles, but we see a lot of cases where they're sustaining heavy losses. We have a city in the Rus Principality, Skulzelsk, which is just about your only city in the Rus lands that holds out longer than like a week. And they do a couple sallies out that inflict losses on the Mongols, kill a couple commanders' sons, and the Mongols get kind of demoralized on that. And they have a horrific slaughter they unleash on the city. In Hungary itself, so of course everyone knows the Battle of Muhi, the famous battle on the bridge, and right, Mongol victory, very decisive Mongol victory. The Hungarian army is destroyed. The king flees. His brother sustains mortal injuries. But what we see from our Mongolian accounts, because we have accounts from the Mongols that are translated into Chinese, into Persian. We have some of our Franciscans who, while they're in the Mongol Empire, they're asking the Mongols about these things. And what we tend to get portrayed is that the Mongols are seeing the Battle of Muhi as one of their greatest victories, because it was very closely, in the Mongols' own words, this was a very closely run thing. That you have a certain point in the battle, the troops, or some of the princes, they wanted to fall back, right? They try to force this crossing over the bridge, and Batu, he mucks it up. He's supposed to time his crossing to when Subadai is doing a crossing over a pontoon bridge further downstream, but Batu times his attack over the bridge too early, and you have apparently a heavy cavalry charge by King Bela's brother, Kalman in Hungarian, Koloman in Latin. So you normally see him called Koloman. And he sends this charge with the Knights Templar and some of the best heavy cavalry in the kingdom. Nice, like kind of your ideal heavy cavalry formation. Very good form. Everyone's staying in formation, and they charge through. they route this Mongol force back over the bridge. It's not a huge force, but it seems to have been a very elite, kind of hand-picked one. And one of the guy leading this kind of vanguard force, a specialty force, he's some sort of close companion of Batu, kind of one of Batu's favorites. And Kalman apparently physically picks him up and throws him off of the bridge into the river, right? Like, badass, right? So cool. But the crossing doesn't go well, and the princes, they want to withdraw, and we have two differing accounts. On one where it's Batu, another where it's Subadai. They give a heroic speech, which convinces everyone to stay, and of course they cross her. They find a new strategy. So the Hungarians leave a bridge guard on one end of the bridge. The Mongols bring up catapults and just bomb them, right, throwing rocks into them, and then they rush over the bridge, surround the Hungarian camp, and at that point the battle is effectively lost. But even still, you have the Hungarian cavalry, a percentage of it, right? This is something the sources are making clear too. Most of the Hungarians by this point have given up and don't know what's going on, and they're terrified. But you have a very well-formed corps under the Duke Kalman, the king's brother, some of the archbishops, and like their households and stuff, like their retinue, and the Knights Templar. And they send, I forget what it is now, but like 2 or 3 charges where they actually push the Mongols off. But the problem is, it's just this small group who's kind of willing to resist. And as they do this, and of course you have to keep in mind, they've been fighting for like over 10 hours. They haven't slept by this point, right? These guys are tired, injured. They might have been hurt in the first encounter. And every time they go out, the Mongols are ready for them, and they're shooting at them. And by the end of it, the Templars are killed to a man. Kalman suffers mortal injuries that he will eventually die from. The Archbishop's killed, and at that point, the whole army routs and is defeated. So our Mongol accounts, they're really emphasizing, in their view, kind of a couple consistent themes. This idea that the king of Hungary has a very large, very strong army, that it's mostly cavalry. They're always emphasizing the horsemen of the Hungary, Keller and Bashkir, they're calling it. And we have in the secret history of the Mongols, or one Mongolian language source that survives, there's a reference to the sharp swords of the people of the far west. And it's kind of, it could be interpreted as everyone in Western Asia, like the Rus, the Kipchaks, the Europeans, might not even be specifically about literally the swords, but just kind of saying, yeah, these guys at the other end of the world, they're tough mofos, right? But you could also interpret this as, yeah, this is a memory of, yeah, these guys had good quality swords, and we know from other accounts the Mongols had a high opinion of European metalworking. We have one of the guys they capture in Hungary. He's brought all the way back to Mongolia, and he builds a silver tree in the imperial capital that pours alcohol out of its branches and things. The silver tree of Harahorim. So the Battle of Muhi in particular, it's a tough thing, and the Mongol sources, like sources written by people working for the Mongols, glorifying the Mongol conquests, are saying this was a tough battle. Now, there's probably a degree of they want to play it up themselves, because if you say the enemy was great, we're even greater for having defeated them. But I think it is it seems to be capturing kind of an authentic belief that was tough, right? And it wasn't easy. Now, when we talk about the withdrawal and stuff, these are hard battles that, the army's getting battered. It's still winning, right? But if the Pyrrhic victories, right? If you win every single battle at that kind of cost, you cannot complete a conquest of all of Europe. And so something Stephen has emphasized too is, so in the Great Hungarian, if you picture the Kingdom of Hungary in the 13th century, you kind of have 4 main parts. So you have the east, at the Transylvania, so kind of very mountainous region. You have the Great Hungarian Plain in the center, so flatland steppe. Then you have the Danube River, kind of does a big arc right through the center to cut these in 2 halves. You have Western Hungary, slightly more rugged, more densely populated, more and better fortifications. And then you have the southwestern part of the kingdom in what's today Croatia. So very mountainous and a little bit more heavily fortified again. And what seems to happen is they cross the border into Western Hungary, and they still win most of the encounters. But now the sieges aren't really going as well. So for that, we have to talk a bit about how the Mongols take cities and their what they have access to. So the main catapult they're using is called a traction catapult. So this is a Chinese-style catapult, which is mainly running off of manpower. So we have a very large frame and a lot of ropes and teams of men who pull on these in uniform, and they're very well trained, and they can throw projectile. I don't have exact numbers off the top of my head, but these are quite capable of taking down city walls, and so we see this in China and Central Asia, in the Rus principalities. But there's caveats here. Again, this is credit to Stephen Powell for his argument. I'm explaining his work here right now. What you tend to see for a lot of these fortifications in these regions is, in China, for example, they're built out of stamped earth in floodplains often, flat land, easy approaches. In Central Asia, mud bricks, stamped earth, again, often in flat land. In the Rus principalities, wooden and earth fortifications, most of the time in flat land or on very slight hills. So these seem to be kind of your ideal spots to operate these sorts of siege machines, because they struggle with hitting more elevated targets. And the Mongols like to employ like huge numbers of them. We have one report of a city in China, they employ something like 400 of these catapults. And they just have continuous fire to pound down the walls. And this is what's different from the Mongol siege techniques compared to a lot of medieval techniques. They are using catapults to put holes through the walls to get into the city. What differs with a lot of European siege warfare, siege warfare in the Crusades against these huge stone castles, but even a small stone castle, people are not using even a trebuchet, like a really powerful counterweighted trebuchet, to go physically through the walls. You use these to break down the crenellations on the wall, to break down the towers, sort of the spots where the defenders can fire from, in order for you to be able to get your ladders or towers up to the walls to cross them, or to safely get sappers to the base of the wall to dig underneath, undermine the wall, and bring it down. And this is example, like the best examples are with these huge Crusader fortifications in the Holy Land of Levant, and the Mamluks, very efficient at siege warfare, right? Excellent. They're bringing huge numbers of trebuchets and catapults and all types of machines with them, but they're not using them to pound down through the walls, right? It's clearing the guys on the walls so you can get up and go underneath the walls to bring them down or to go over them. Or you're bringing down the towers, or you're shooting into the city itself to demoralize the people in the city. So the Mongols, catapults they have in 1241, early 1242, by the time they get into Western Hungary, they're not doing a good job of making the elevation for your more elevated fortifications. This is very common in Central Europe. You're building your fortifications on top of hills or mountains, because it's kind of a difference in the fortification design too. The fortifications the Mongols are generally fighting in the East Central Asia, these are around population centers. The fortifications in Europe are often residences or hardpoints rather than the main population centers. So because there's less people in them, you can build them on a narrower base, like these hills and things, and you can use a bit more expensive material because you don't need as much material. So one of the best examples is the siege of Esztergom. So Esztergom is one of the main cities in Hungary in the Middle Ages, 13th century, before Buda is built after the Mongol invasion. An estergom consists of, you have the suburbs and you have a wooden wall around at the base, a ditch around that wall, and then you have a hill and a stone citadel at the top of that hill. You can still visit it today. It's that the medieval citadel is gone. The one you see today is a later one, but it's still a very beautiful city. If you get a chance to go there, it's not very far from Budapest. You can get there in an afternoon, and you can get kind of the same effect today when you're standing at the ground looking up at this. One side's protected by the river, the other side is a really steep approach. Like that's a hard site to take. And what happens in 1242 when the Mongols siege it, they wipe out the lower town and this wooden wall, like fairly easily. Like they fill in the moats and then break down the walls. They use the catapults to fill in the moats, apparently. Like they're throwing bundles of dirt out of the catapults to fill in the moats. They get in, the lower city gets burnt down, but then they are unable to take the citadel on top of the hill, right? And it seems that, again, they're not able to make the elevation difference. And when they get up there, or if they happen to get up there, they're really struggling to puncture through the stone wall. And at the same time, we're told there's a very efficient defense led of the city, and they have, I forget what the word is in Latin, but it's you can translate it as catapult or crossbow, ballistarius, I think. And essentially, they're doing something with these that the Mongols are finding very troublesome, and apparently even destroying some of the Mongols' own siege equipment. And in Stephen's view, the siege of Esztergom is kind of like the hinge where things change, where Batu gets frustrated enough where he goes like, look, we wanted the loot and stuff. It got denied to us because they burnt down the lower town. We can't get the citadel. We're kind of losing our men here. And if we keep going further west, the promise seems to just be there is more of this. And this current army that we have is tired, a bit worn out, and simply not big enough to complete that conquest. And as per Stephen Powell's theory, the withdrawal begins essentially out of this, where they go like, look, we can't continue the campaign, so let's fall back. And where were they falling back to? I'm less certain of that. We know the general pattern is the Mongols like to fight in winter, so start a campaign in the fall, fight through the winter, then you start to retreat in the spring, and then you rest your troops over the summer in the steppe. They get a chance to rest, kind of heal some injuries, fix some of the equipment. Horses get a chance to eat in the pasture, get some weight back on them so that they're strong enough to fight again in the fall. So maybe it was starting out like this. This is generally the pattern they observe over the last couple of years. The aberration is actually 1241, where they spend the whole year campaigning in Hungary. So it might have started like this, where they're like, all right, let's step back and we'll regroup and we'll reassess, maybe get reinforcements. But what happens during the withdrawal, they learn that Urgadai is dead. And they go, all right, we're probably not going to be able to get more troops. So that's it for the campaign for now, and we'll come back later. And this is a kind of a nuanced point, but I want to emphasize here. The Mongols seem to leave Hungary and Europe in general thinking this will be a tough target, but it's not an unconquerable target. We can still come back and assess it and conquer it, but we're putting it on kind of the same threat scale that conquering all of China or all the Middle East or all of Europe or all of China, all of the Middle East is put onto, right? That we need to come back with like 150,000 fresh men and a bunch of new supplies and new siege weapons if we can get them, that come in there and take it, right? If I was to bet my money on that, that is essentially their plan going out of 1242. And what ends up happening is the new Khan, Guyuk, he is actually saying that he's going to go and do that. And it's kind of hard to see in the sources, but it looks like he's started gathering an army for this purpose, starts going west, and then he dies in 1248. Maybe suspicious, maybe poisoning. It's kind of, some sources say that, some say others, but he sends messages to the Pope saying this, I'm going to come conquer you, come and submit to me. The guy after him is Mönke, his cousin, so Mönke leads a coup, he kills all of Guyuk's guys, takes power, And Mönke, he does a big census of all the resources in the empire because he wants these big armies to complete the conquests. And he sends a huge army into China, believing he's going to complete the conquest of southern China, and a huge army into the Middle East, believing it's going to complete the conquest of the Middle East. Of course, Mönke dies on campaign in 1259, and the empire ends up fracturing. So, in your what if scenario, what if the Mongols come back to Europe? Your most realistic outcome for a Mongol victory in Europe is that Mönke lives like another 10 or 20 years. And after they complete the conquest of China, conquest of the Middle East, then they go, all right, now we can levy 150,000 men to go and attack Europe. And then that's when you're seeing the most realistic chance of that happening. Whether they do it in our made up scenario is another matter. But that's your, if I was playing God in a made up story or something, that's what I would say your most likely chance of that happening. Because Mönke is a guy with kind of the vision and the willpower to force these vast resources of the empire into these sort of tasks. Right? There's been estimates that the Mongol army by the time of Mönke's death, and not just ethnic Mongols, right, all the peoples fighting for it, is somewhere in 1 million people spread out across the world. Right? This is a huge military force being tasked with conquering different ends of the planet at once. So it's just kind of the way history unfolds that such a vast force doesn't get sent right back to Europe again in 1260 or 1270 or what have you.
So you touched on it. So I guess we'll jump in real quick to the alternate scenario. And I've posted about this online. I've gotten, which I appreciate you coming on to maybe set me straight here. Of course, there's a lot of my view of this is that, as you're saying, I mean, you gave the perfect analogy with the castles about how there's a lot of things that sort of on paper are unfavorable for the Mongols, whether it's the castles, whether it's the metalwork, whether it's crossbows, whether it's heavy cavalry, whether it's pasture land to support large enough armies to do all these things, the density of the castles, the coastlines, which obviously the Mongols are not famous for their naval capabilities. So it seems to me to be a lot of unfavorable things that line up on paper. My theory, which of course you can correct me on or add as you would like here, my theory, which you made a great point actually about the religious fervor of the Mongols, the idea that everything under the blue sky belongs to the Mongols. And so there's this sort of religious manifest destiny, as it were. My theory is sort of goes along the lines that the Mongols being a nomadic people, being raiders, and that the raider mindset is generally prefers easier targets. And as you're saying, they came away sort of viewing Hungary and Europe as a more difficult target. And so it's not that they maybe didn't have the capability, but I think that the sort of raider psyche or temperament is sort of not suited for the incredible grind that it would have been, in my opinion. Does that seem like a fair estimate, or maybe you could talk about that a little bit?
Well, so what I see on that is first, of course, when we discuss the counterfactuals, I think that the China example is a very pertinent one. So if the Mongols had not been able to pass south of the Yangtze River, we would talk about it as, oh, of course they couldn't, because we have comparison of the Jurchen Jin or the Khitan Lao, so people who fight very similar fashion to the Mongols, who also are unable to go south of the Yangtze River. So you have that military comparison there, and you can say, look, this is very humid, kind of much more rugged, very kind of wetland territory. Like this is not favorable to the type of warfare they like, and it has these huge cities, and like they're geographically large cities, well fortified, lots of people in them. And okay, the Song Dynasty, it's not the best army of all time, but their reputation's been much more maligned in modern accounts. They put up a serious fight. Like, these are guys who fight the Mongols almost continuously for 40 years. Like, this is one of the changes that we've come to discussing the conquest of China. It used to be, again, this kind of stereotypical meme version of the Mongols where the conquest of China is an easy thing for them. What a lot of the more recent work has emphasized, like in the work of Christopher Atwood, for example, all of the warfare in China is absolutely a grind. And there's the taking and retaking of cities and mass slaughter as of these cities, of these people, and huge armies. And I could go on and on and on about this. And they learn to overcome this in part through the mass employment of a lot of these Han peoples to take on those sort of more grindy roles for them, while maintaining the cavalry component for when it will do the most amount of work. So you often see it's a Han army, sometimes with a Mongol commander, sometimes they're Han armies under Han Chinese commanders, right? So with this Yangtze example, if the Mongols didn't go south of the Yangtze or never conquered south of the Yangtze, we'll go, of course, that's the natural limits to the expansion. But they do happen to go south. So now instead people go, oh, well, Southeast Asia, that's the natural limit to their expansion. So that's just kind of my bit of caution on that point, is that we have the habit of reading backwards from history and going, well, that's how it had to have happened. Now, there's a lot of differences with the China case, though, right? China is not Europe. China, geographically, much closer to the Mongolian homeland. So this is an area that they can rate much more important, because it's just closer. It's more important to deal with. It's a more vulnerable frontier, even when they're ruling over northern China. You can't just leave the Song Dynasty, a state with something like 60 million people living in it. You can't just leave that alone, right? And the Song Dynasty actually attacks the Mongols first, so it's the aggressor in that war. Now, war was probably going to happen anyways. The Mongols weren't exactly doves of peace in the 13th century, but right, like that was going to be a grind no matter what. And again, what I was mentioned earlier, there is the political will to put the resources of the empire, and this is a political will resting a lot on the charisma of the Chinggisid lineage, to put all of these resources. And a guy like Mönke does this huge census to kind of organize the resources of this vast empire for the task of conquering something like China. So to have a conquest of Europe, what you essentially need is someone like a Mönke Han to sit in what is today Ukraine, Russia, bring a huge army of horse archers with him, but also levy all those peoples from the Rus principalities, the Caucasus, probably from the Middle East, to serve these kind of roles for them in Europe. That's kind of the only way this really works. And it's not going to be, like, I want to make this very clear. There's no version of this where this is easy or an obvious conquest for the Mongols. This could very much, even if in our mythical scenario here, you had all of these things in favor, this still might go very bad, just because it's not, like you're saying, this is not going to be something you can go through quickly and easily do. The just a million little sieges of places. You can't just leave a bunch of little castles in your rear all the time, and you have to leave part of your army to sieges. And if this place is holding out for 6 months and this one falls fast, this one takes longer. And even if they have the trebuchets, right, and they do end up getting the trebuchets, but they use them famously in the siege of Qiangyang in 1273. So this is an example of, we had this new technology, let's bring it to China so we can use it to get through these major centers, right? That's example of the political will, the charisma, the resources of the empire being put to this use. Funnily enough, we actually have, according to the account of the biography of one of the advisors, Yelu Chutsai, apparently at some point in the planning stage, they suggest just sending a huge army of Han Chinese ahead of them to the western end of the continent to send into Europe, which, had that happened, would have been already more insane than the actual campaign was. But they get talked out of that. They say something along the lines of, "Oh, these people would be unsuited to that," because in the medieval mind, people are genetically suited to this particular climate and can't just put on a coat. But also, be very hard to walk a huge army all the way across the world like that. So now, where was I going with this? The comparison I want to make, though, is with what actually does happen after 1242. So I said Batu doesn't go back to Mongolia. He's setting up in the Volga steppes, so today like central Russia, and parts of Ukraine, Kazakhstan. So this is what we call today the Golden Horde. So the Golden Horde rules over this area for the next couple of centuries. And for the first 20 years of its existence or so, it's still a part of the Mongol Empire. And you do see them launch new attacks on Europe. There's a major one on Poland in 1259. They sack a number of cities. We have a couple sources saying that's more destructive on Poland than the 1241 invasion was. They have a few smaller raids on the frontier in Hungary, 1260, 1262. There's some, but they're very small. We don't really know where they go exactly, other than they're in Hungary very briefly. The Mongols at the same time are expanding along the lower Danube, kind of what's today Bulgaria, Romania. They briefly make Serbia their vassal. They're on the borders of Constantinople, and they're attacking Lithuania. They basically devastate the kingdom of Lithuania. So if you're the king of Hungary in the second half of the 13th century, the Mongols aren't attacking you again directly, but they're kind of spreading all around your frontier like this, right? So the Hungarians are quite aware this is happening, but they're not being directly attacked again until 1285. So this is the second Mongol invasion of Hungary, and this is one that's perhaps even more than the first invasion. There's just a lot of nonsense written about it. Now, in big part, this is because for the first Mongol invasion of Europe, especially Hungary, we have a lot of very good sources. I've referred to a number of them so far. We have eyewitnesses, we have tons of charters, we have letters, we have stuff from the Mongol side, we have archaeology. The archaeology has just revealed like absolutely terrifying things, like from the massacres and the sieges and destruction. And the Great Hungarian Plain is essentially depopulated after 1242. And it gets resettled with nomads who are supposed to fight against the Mongols, Cumans. So for 1241, 1242, we can say all of these things about where the Mongols were, who they attacked, in what order, what they did. For the 1285 invasion, we do not have comparable sources. We have actually quite a number of sources. My current PhD and my book that I've been writing is kind of on this topic. I've written a few videos and podcasts and things on this, but my views have kind of changed on it over time. But it used to be, or not used to, you still see a lot of people say something like, so the Mongols invade, they go into Hungary, and they get stuck in these sieges, and then the king of Hungary sends an army after them. There's a battle, they lose, and they're chased out, and they never come back. You'll see a lot of variations of that. What we actually see in our sources, which consists of some letters, some charters, so like diplomas the king of Hungary would issue to reward someone for their service in the invasion. You have some chronicles and things. So you have like a guy in Germany saying, at this point in time, the Mongols came and attacked Hungary. You have stuff from the Rus principalities. You have stuff even from Mamluk Egypt, written in Arabic. But all of them kind of talk on different parts of the campaign. So some guy says they attacked at this point. Most of our Eastern sources are talking about when the Mongols left and what happens during the withdrawal, which is a very famous disaster for them. But we can only kind of slowly piece together what's happened like in between all of these points from these various bits. And what looks like has happened is, first of all, we can talk a bit about the aims. And it does not seem that the aim was to actually conquer the Kingdom of Hungary in 1285, because we have no real record of sieges, or at least lengthy sieges. So we see, for example, archaeologically, stuff in what is today Eastern Slovakia. This is an area that they don't attack in 1241, 1242, but we have records of them being there in 1285, and we find stuff that's probably on the route they took, and we find like some arrowheads and a little bit of like fire, an example around like a church or places that were in use in 1285. And then we know they coming from the northeast. There's some sort of attack across the Great Hungarian Plain, and we know the armies, they make it all the way to Pest. So today Budapest, it was at that time a couple different cities. Buda and Pest were separate cities on either side of the river. And in Pest, the mother of the king of Hungary sees two Mongol armies link up in front of the walls. There might be some sort of skirmish outside of the walls, but doesn't say what happens next. And then most of our sources are actually about what is happening during the withdrawal. So what we see, because they're only there like 3 months or so, it's like February to March, or February to April 1285, something like that. I forget the exact date range. Most of our information is about how they get back to Transylvania. One army cuts south, south over the Carpathians. There's some fights in the mountains with the local people who live there. So these are the Transylvanian Saxons, the Zekli, the Zeklers, so a kind of Hungarian ethnic, that's the whole thing there, and some Vlachs, so like Romanian people. So these are people who are generally fighting very lightly armored ambush tactics. The Zekli fight a lot is similar way to the Mongols, unarmored horse archers. There's some sort of raid, and a lot of the Mongols have a large number of prisoners with them who are freed in these raids. But this whole army, or this part of the army, pushes through the Carpathians, gets back to the Mongol-controlled lands south of the Carpathians along the lower Danube, today Bulgaria, Romania. The other half of the army is led by a prince named Tolobuka. He goes to the eastern part of Transylvania and basically gets stuck there. Now, exactly why, kind of unclear. It might be he's tried to siege a settlement in order to force his way through one of the passes, but we have in one of our descriptions from one of the letters that we have is that they've built barricades in the mountain passes again and manned them. So similar to what we had in 1241, but probably these are better built ones in better expectation of, all right, they're going to be coming this way, let's do something. And this particular army isn't able to force its way through that barricade, or exactly what it is. And again, it's not exactly clear, but it looks like they're forced in place for a long time. And what is an unusually wet and cold spring, there's like excessive snow and rain, and some sort of disease ends up spreading amongst the army stuck in one place for too long. They probably did not bring enough cattle and things with like supplies with them. So we have reports of cannibalism, like eating their own horses, and they get sent off route. They're trying to find another pass through the mountains, and there's more ambushes and things on them. And in one account, written by a guy, people who say they spoke to eyewitnesses and of the Rus who were fighting in the army, they say, and this is of course classic medieval hyperbole, but it says the only survivors are the Khan and his wife, and the wife is riding out on the only horse that survived. So yeah, it's a classic image, but it's it's hyperbole. But what is clear though, there's huge losses sustained at this point in the campaign, because this is perhaps the single most consistent detail across all of our sources, from Poland to the Rus principalities to Egypt to Germany, is these references to this epidemic and this issue during the withdrawal. What we do not have is references to an actual battle between the Hungarian forces and the Mongols. We do not have descriptions of sieges. We have descriptions of fights outside of some of these settlements and some of these castles, but we don't have descriptions of them trying to take those particular castles and things. And we don't know exactly the whereabouts of the king at the time, Ladislaus IV. This is a guy, Ladislaus IV, Laszlo IV, Laszlo de Cuman, he's often known as, because he was half Cuman on his mother's side. And he gets a lot of bad rap. He gets accused afterwards of having invited the Mongols in. This is almost certainly just slander at him because he had a lot of enemies. He was very unpopular. But what it seems, judging from the charters he issued, is that he spent the whole time in Pest. Now, this is kind of mirroring what his grandfather Bela IV did in 1241, where Bela IV, he stays in Pest, and the order seems to be for all of the forces of the kingdom to link up with him and then meet up, and then they would all set out together against the Mongols, and this is what happens in the lead up to the Battle of Muhi in April 1241. What seems to happen here, for whatever reason, this doesn't happen, either on account of how unpopular Ladislaus was. Perhaps the attack was so sudden, people are so afraid they don't go out to do this. There is a growth in the amount of castles in Hungary after 1242. However, most of these castles being built are in the far west of the kingdom, so west of the Danube, not really on the area the Mongols actually are. There's some, especially in the North Slovakia and in kind of the southern parts of the Carpathians, but not huge numbers. So what it seems, at least in the case in Slovakia in the northeast, where we have this archaeology and some of our charters rewarding guys for fighting, it looks like we have guys who are sallying out to attack Mongol parties as they're going by. Some of them are winning these engagements because they're sending the severed heads of Mongols they kill back to the king at Pest. All right, so we know the king is staying in one place because everyone knows where to send the severed heads to him. Right? That doesn't do any good if you don't know where the king is. Where do you send your head? And one of these guys in particular, he becomes quite the character, because when the Mongols attack Poland in 1288, he goes out on his own to go and chase after them because he's kind of on the border. So this is a guy who hated the Mongols, right, and was like loved fighting them, and apparently good at it. Sorry. Of course, we don't know exactly the scale. In one of them, he attacks a unit of 1,000 and kills their commander, but seems the rest of the force gets away. But again, kind of the image we have is the Mongols get into Hungary and they're splitting up to ravage a lot of territory and take a lot of prisoners, right? And avoid sieges. Now, we know they have siege equipment because they brought it into Poland in their attacks. We know they use it in Crimea in the 14th century. We know they have access to these siege weapons, but there's no indication they brought them with them in 1285. All right, so it seems they've bypassed the castles entirely. Now, is this in expectation of we know they're going to be difficult, or this is just a raid, or alternatively, were they trying to ignore all these other ones and just go as fast as they can to Pest to try and get the king and cut the head off of the snake? Maybe they tried that and they get to Pest. They find it's been refortified because they took Pest very easily in 1241, but this time they can't take the city. Now, do they actually try and siege the city? Our only source from this is this charter issued by the king's mother. She does not describe a siege. She basically describes them showing up at the walls, kind of having a runabout, and then leaving. And again, like I said earlier, or a few minutes ago, when we have these ambushes on them, on the Mongols while they're in Transylvania, they have a lot of prisoners with them. So if they were fleeing Hungary in a rout, they probably would not be bogged down with thousands and thousands of prisoners, because this is one of our other most consistent details in our charters and chronicles and all of our brief references on this invasion. It's very notable that they spend the most amount of time of these short references describing this disaster of the withdrawal for one of the armies, and that they have a lot of prisoners and loot with them. So it looks like they've passed the unfortified locations and just tried. It's a hit and run, more or less. They're not trying to conquer it. They're trying to grab what they can, get out. And in essence, it's kind of foreshadowing what we see in the next couple centuries with the raids of the Crimean Tartars, with the raids that come in, grab a bunch of people to take as slaves to sell or a bunch of loot, and you bypass fortification. You move quick so that the enemy army doesn't get a chance to mobilize and catch you, and you get out of there before they can do anything. Now, one thing that I've been arguing in my current work is that this is very much a crime of opportunity on the part of the Mongols. Building up to 1285, the Kingdom of Hungary gets very destabilized. As said, King Ladislaus, he's very unpopular. There's a revolt of the Cumans in Hungary in 1282. A lot of them leave. They go to the Golden Horde. We know King Ladislaus, he wins a victory over the Cumans at Lake Hod in 1282. And we know he also is famous for a victory at a battle on the Marchfeld against the King of Bohemia. And so these are like Ladislaus's two great victories. And these are in all of our sources on King Ladislaus. They're like, Ladislaus is the second coming of Samson from the Bible. He's this great warrior. God intervened and helped him win these great victories. We have nothing like this for 1285. So if Ladislaus, who was a guy, not a good king, very unpopular, if he had won a real victory over the Mongols, he would not be letting that propaganda coup sit on the table, right? That's money you're leaving on the table if you say nothing about that. But we have no references to it, right? Either because his armies didn't mobilize for him, or they didn't get a chance to, or perhaps, and this has also been suggested, the strategy was just, we cannot fight these guys in the field, so everyone stay put and don't do anything if they come at you. We've built a bunch of new castles. Most of these are not very big. Like when we say stone castles, everyone's picturing like the castles of Edward I, right? These wonderful, huge, concentric things. Our evidence for Hungary suggests at this point most of these castles are consisting of like a kind of a residence, a chapel, one tower, and then a kind of small curtain wall, right? These are not big structures. They can't hold a big garrison. A lot of these guys are building them because, hey, that lord over there, he built one, and I want one too. Our exceptions are this huge defensive line along the Danube, where these are built by the king on the royal expenditure. They're selling like the crown jewels to pay for these. They build these huge new fortifications at Esztergom, at Visegrad, and Buda and Pest. And there's an island in between Buda and Pest in the Danube. It's called Rabbit Island at the time. Today it's called Margaret Island. That gets two castles just on that. So basically, anywhere along the Danube there could be a crossing. They've built a huge castle. And the Danube in 1241, the Mongols had not been able to cross it until it froze in the winter of 1241. So their idea seems to be, look, if the Mongols come back, screw everything out in the east. Right? We'll leave the Cumans there. They might fight the Mongols in the field for us, but we're going to stop them at the Danube. Because the Danube itself is already a formidable natural barrier, and these castles are going to secure all of the potential crossings about it. So what might have happened in 1285, even if they had siege equipment with them, which again, we don't really have any evidence for, but that also might just be because our sources for 1285 aren't in detail enough to really say that. They might have gotten to Pest and looked, oh shit, yeah, we can't get through that, right? Even if we take this one, there's all those castles on the island in the middle, and then there's the one on the other side, and then we didn't bring a big enough army for that, right? Now, as I said, that this is a crime of opportunity. So the Hungarian kingdom in the early 1280s gets very destabilized. Ladislaus is very unpopular. At the same time, the Golden Horde spends most of the period between 1260 into 1280s at war with all of its neighboring Khanites. Right? So after the Mongol Empire breaks apart, these Khanites, they go to war with each other. And if you're a Mongol Khan, here's the math you're making. The guys in Europe, they're going to stay in their castles, right? They're not coming out into the steppe. But those guys down there, they're my cousins. They can fight as well in the steppe as I can. And if I take all of my forces away to attack Europe, they're going to come in my unopened patio here and wreck all my furniture. Right? They're going to come in there and sack your settlements, your pastures, whatever, and now you're screwed. What happens in the 1280s is there's a period of peace between all of the Khanites. So they're finally able to go, hey, look, we're secure enough. We can feel confident pulling our forces away from those other frontiers. And what we get a description of is this great sort, John and Plano Carpini, our Franciscans. These are wonderful sources. They're very observant because they're taking all these details to prepare Europe against another Mongol invasion. He's saying in 1246, 1245, 1246, the border guard the Mongols leave on the far western border with Europe is like 6,000 strong. We know from other sources that the border guards they're leaving against the other Mongol Khanites are like tens of thousands strong, 50,000 here, 100,000 here, like big enough that when they pull up these border guards in one of the civil wars they're fighting, it's enough for the other guy to basically automatically win. So Europe is, in their calculation, it's tough to conquer, right? They know this is huge resources to conquer. It's not going to be easy. But it's also not going anywhere. So it's tough to conquer, but low priority compared to our neighbors who are very dangerous, can invade our territory like it's nothing. So 1285 is taking advantage of peace to invade a destabilized Hungarian kingdom, and maybe them going, look, this is our best chance to get in there and get what we want. The guy leading the invasion, he's a very young prince. It seems to actually be his first ever campaign at all. We have no records of him doing any fighting prior to that. So this is just him kind of going like, look, I want to be the next Khan. The Khan at the time is a guy who's very sick, is insane according to some sources. So it's clear he's on his way out. So the guy, at least that I've been arguing, he's going, look, this is our best single chance to do any sort of victory in Hungary. I'm going to take what forces I can get, my personal retinue, some of the Western commanders, princes from Halych, Volhynia. I'm going to get in there, get a bunch of loot, get a bunch of slaves. It's going to make my reputation. I'm going to play it up as a big victory, come back home, and be the next Khan. What ends up happening, they raid whatever in Hungary, but then he loses all his slaves, loses all his loot, loses a bunch of men crossing the mountains. He can't become Khan in a normal way anymore. So what happens? There's a coup the very next year, and he leads a group of princes to split power between them within the Golden Horde. Now, this is very weird for the Mongols. They don't generally like sharing power. So the fact that this guy's had to do it kind of tells us his rules a little, it's not quite a secure footing. And the first thing he does when he becomes Khan, he attacks Poland. And this army appears much larger. It does much better, right? It's not, you'll sometimes see people write things on the internet like, oh, that time the Poles destroyed the Mongols. And it's more like they go and they try sieging a few cities. They don't really get into them. Krakow, I think it's Krakow, gets newly refortified just before the Mongol invasion in 1287. And the Mongols aren't able to take it. They destroy all the suburbs. They loot a whole bunch of the countryside, and then they leave. There's no defeat. They're not really repulsed. They're just not able to take the cities, and they go, look, screw it. I'm done. The new Khan, he gets pissed because he sees one of the other generals already sieging Krakow before he gets there. And he already blames this guy for the defeat in Hungary. And he goes, I'm just taking my ball and going home. I don't want to play this game anymore. And the year after that, he goes to war with the Ilkhanites again. And he loses that. And then the year after that, he tries it again, loses that too, and the year after that, they're so pissed at him, they gang up and kill him. And after this, the warfare with Europe like cuts off dramatically. You have more raids, especially on the area of Sandomierz in eastern Poland. This they kind of see it as like a highway for them. They can go in there, loot the countryside, get what they want, and leave. So Sandomierz gets a big attack in 1293, I think it is, again in the early 1300s. There's warfare between the Mongols and the Hungarians on the southern border of Hungary along the Danube, where they've come up through like Romania, Bulgaria, and now there's some of their forces getting into Hungarian sphere of influence there, but they don't quite make the crossing there, and they pull back. And you see small raids. And going into the 14th century, though, other than these raids or threats of raids, you generally see the Khans of the Golden Horde pretty happy to just kind of negotiate things away with the Europeans. So you have the example of Halych, Volhynia, so what's today Western Ukraine. There's kind of a crisis over it in the early 1320s when the princes die off, and it becomes like a three-way kind of conflict between the Golden Horde, the Poles, and the Hungarian and Lithuanians over who gets it, and they end up kind of deciding to split it between them. So it still has to pay tax to the Golden Horde, but the Lithuanians and a Golden Horde official get to stay there. So probably sucks for the people who live there because they're being taxed by the Poles, the Lithuanians, and the Golden Horde, but there's no big war after that. And you get the few kind of border conflicts until the Lithuanians really take advantage of this instability the Golden Horde goes through in the second half of the 14th century and essentially annex what is today Ukraine down to the Black Sea. And again, part of this is it's not like constant warfare. The Khans of the Golden Horde agree to give some of this over. Other times, the Lithuanians just take it. The Lithuanians ally with some of these guys against the Rus principalities, especially the Prince of Moscow. And the point, though, is this is a frontier where the Golden Horde is kind of a bit more hands-off. And at the same time as this is launching huge invasions of the Ilkhanate or the Tsagatai Khanate in Central Asia. So it's not that they don't have armies, but they don't want to send them to this frontier. And I think it just keeps coming back to this idea I've expressed a few times now. It's going to be hard to conquer Europe. You can't conquer Europe with the other Mongols going to attack your side. And also Europe, with the exception of the Lithuanians and a few raids by the Hungarian and Polish kings, the Europeans aren't really going to come into your territory. Or at least they're not going to come into your heartland. They can't operate in the steppe. And I think what explains the dynamic more than anything is that. And there simply is not the political will to try and find a solution that overcomes that the way they could overcome that impasse they get in China with the Yangtze or the terrain over there. And that is more than anything, that's my explanation for the relationship that we see unfold over the 13th and 14th century.
And I think that makes sense, thinking about China as a next door neighbor that's very close, and thinking about Europe as the sort of the far off frontier in that way. With, obviously if it's more difficult, why are you going to go however many thousands of miles away to the frontier to try to crack that nut, as opposed to, whatever the things that are much closer. I have a couple more questions.
You have a Mongol state that is right on the frontier, it ends up having a bunch of antagonistic Mongol states all around its frontier.
Right. So, yeah, of course. And I think that's another really good point, is how you can't, obviously once it's sort of fractured, and it's not only that they can't mobilize the main force, but it's that the Golden Horde, which is right next to them, has to look out for the other Khanates behind them at the same time.
Yeah. Right. And they've made it clear, you need a huge army to do this conquest. You're basically going to have to clean out the Golden Horde of troops. And we don't know exactly how many troops the Golden Horde has. We often see numbers given of like 200,000, 300,000 in the sources. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. It's probably giving us an idea of the range of the total possible troops it could raise, but that's cleaning it up. There's no one left behind once you do that. So if the Ilkhanate or the Tsagatai Hanate or Haidu in Central Asia, we know these guys attacked the Golden Horde frontier all sorts of times. If they know there's nobody in the Golden Horde, they're going to go right to the center of the Horde and take its capital cities, Sarai, and these trade cities on the Volga River. And this is what happens in the 1390s when you have Tamerlane, Emir Timur, based in Central Asia, based in Iran. He marches his armies all the way through the steppes to sack the major cities of the Golden Horde all along the Volga River. So this is something they are capable of, and and the Golden Horde is terrified of this happening. So, and the King of Hungary, no matter how powerful he is, isn't going to send an army across the steppes to do
that. Is it a fair characterization in my mind, because I'm a layman and mostly ignorant of Mongol history in any depth? Is it a fair characterization to say that these other conquests that they had, whether it's in the Middle East, in China, that sort of the style of that conquest is that these other places were in giant walled cities, and that would be much different than a conquest in a place like Europe, where there's essentially a very large density or a high density of castles, and that's sort of is a different, like you mentioned, ride into the city and take the capital city, and then sort of like what they were thinking about doing with Pest. And that Europe, because of the way it was very decentralized and had so many castles, is sort of a much different challenge.
It's certainly a factor. Now, interestingly, we more or less have this exact argument made by an Arabic source in the late 1220s or early 1230s, Ibn al-Athir. So this is an author writing in Mosul in northern Iraq, and he's hearing all of these rumors of the Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, which it was ruling like basically today Uzbekistan, Western Kazakhstan, down across Iran and to the borders of India. So very large state. But in essentially the 20 years before the Mongol invasion, the Khwarezmian Empire expands a huge amount and conquers like the last of the Seljuks and a lot of independent powers and things. And what Ibn al-Athir says is that because the Khwarezm Shah had done this, when the Khwarezm Shah flees and dies early in invasion in 1220, right? The invasion starts in 1219. He dies December 1220, spends essentially all of 1220 running away from the Mongols. Because the Mongols are chasing him, this is a strategy the Mongols employ quite a lot in their warfare, is when you have these big states, if you focus on trying to get the king, because of how medieval systems work, and that all the lords and generals and commanders are kind of guys in his retinue, they're guys in his family. So if you're able to get the king and his court, you've cut the head off of the snake. And now every individual site and city is left to its own devices. And what Ibn al-Athir says is because there was essentially no one to step into, or because the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II had wiped out every other king, once he was done, there was no one else to really lead an effective resistance. His son, Jalaluddin Minguberna, or Minguberna, however you want to reconstruct his epithet, he's a very capable commander, but he's not able to take command of things soon enough to put the resources of the empire to an effective anti-Mongol footing. And what you end up with is each individual city left to its own devices. So some are able to, some surrender right away, others resist, and they're punished horribly for it. But what the Mongols are able to accomplish, because these cities fall, in most cases, very quickly. We're talking matter of days, sometimes the same day. We have a couple exceptions where the sieges go on for months due to some infighting amongst the Mongols, skilled defenses or skilled defenders and well-built defenses. So we have a few cases where the sieges go on a long time, but in most cases, the sieges are very short. So even if the Mongol army in overall numbers isn't larger than the overall army of the Khwarezmian Empire, the Mongols are always having local superiority of force, as well as these advantages in morale and stuff. Because when everyone sees our king has fled for his life and he's not going to defend us, it's just up to whatever our local council decides to do. And sometimes what the garrison wants to do is different from what the people in the city want to do, and that ends up being friction between them. So with our European case, the fact that these individual hardpoints are not going to be falling quickly, but you still want to maintain the pressure of the campaign, part of the army they're going to want to have moving on, because they can't just have everyone stay in one spot for 6 months to take each individual fortress. So what would happen in our hypothetical conquest of Central Europe is just a lot of friction bogging down the Mongol army trying to move forward. Now, is the overall defense more effective than others? I would argue our best general defense against the Mongols was first by the Song dynasty, which is putting up 40 years of continued resistance and trying like a theater-wide defense system it's trying to do. But obviously the Song dynasty gets conquered in the end. Those are large cities, well fortified, but in most cases, the cities are easy to approach. And the sieges that go on longer are ones that, and Stephen Powell has another good article on this, tend to be better built in stone or on elevated positions. Such a siege that Mönchehan dies at in 1259. We have examples of the assassin fortresses in northern Iran. Now, most of these fall quickly, not through force, but because the Mongols entice the leader of the Ismaili Nasaris, Rukin ad-Din, to come out and basically order the castles to open their gates to the Mongols. And then the Mongols get in there, loot it, and then destroy the castles. But we have few examples like the fortress of Gurdka in the what's today northeastern Iran, I believe. That is such a well-built city in such a inaccessible location. It holds out for 15 years, right? So that is our most extreme example. Now, the reality is probably most of the time it's kind of a light cordon, like a blockade around it. They're not actively trying to get in, because if you see like what it looks like on a map, it's literally like the top of a mountain sort of thing. It doesn't matter how good your army is. You'd suffer such insane losses that they can't realistically do anything against you at this point with the dissolution of the Ismaili state, that there is no need to press the siege more than that. But if you're in our European example and you have a lot of these little castles, you don't really want to be leaving these in your rear, because guys can sally out, harass your supply lines, harass your lines of communication, and it will be a problem. What you would probably see is just a horrendous amount of violence on the local countryside in an attempt to force people to come out from cities. And this is something John of Plano-Carpina is writing in his account, where he says, please don't just hide up in the cities or in the castles. He says a thing about how the Mongols prefer when people do that, because it's like the piggies hiding in their sty. I think that's probably a little like they're telling him that so that he tells people that. They're like, no, we'd really love it if you did. Please come out, please. Right? But what John of Plano-Carpini is saying, if you do this, the destruction in the countryside is going to be horrendous. And then what you have is a castle that is defending a ruin, right? It's defending burnt crops, burnt villages, burnt town. Any town they can take, the slaughter is going to be horrendous. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's going to be horrific. And like whether these castles are unsiegeable or impregnable, I think that's kind of a moot point in and of itself, because there's going to be mitigating circumstances. Some garrisons, they're not going to want to see this, so they're going to sally out. Some of them are going to choose to submit. Some of them are going to be tricked into surrendering and being killed. Some of them are going to fall through other trickery, or they're just going to get ladders to the walls and sneak up in the dead of night. This is something Plano Carpini also warns about, like, look, they're going to try and trick you and get into these things and come around and stuff like that. Whether you're going to have many of these fortified points on the elevated locations falling to assaults, like they're forcing their ways through the walls, I would assume probably not that many. And this is why, again, why this was annoying for the way the Mongols did warfare is they wanted these sieges to be quick. They were good at sieges, but they wanted them to be quick. And they were used to, like I said, these huge numbers of catapults. You get through the walls, you get in there, it's quick, it's hard, and it's dirty, but it's not a long siege. You have a lot of men outside and a lot of horses. They're going to be eating down all the resources in the local area. So it's not convenient for you to have a long siege there without a big supply line. So when we discuss Hulagu's army, which is huge, like 150,000 men by some estimates, what we have specifically described to us is how in the years preceding Hulagu's march, because of this census, they know what resources they have, and they've cleared people off of the pastures, cleared people off of farmland to turn that into pasture, and they've built these huge supply depots all along the route of of grain and wine and things like this, so that as the army moves, the pastures are clear for the animals, and there's sustenance to provide for the army. Like, this is literally all of the resources of the empire being put to the task to provide for this huge army that's going through what is a lot of desert or very not convenient places to have 100,000 horses marching, right? So, like I said, it's not. I know I've said this already before, but it's not. Conquest of Europe is not going to be easy. Not because I think Europe's great or something. I'm telling you what the Mongols have told us. They think it's going to be hard, and they. It is interesting though that in the accounts we get from the Mongol Empire, like from the translators and things, they're never emphasizing castles ever in the defense. Like this, we can see that there is more of these types of fortifications being built after 1242 in Europe. We can know this archaeologically and from these accounts, and they're not usually expressly connecting this to the Mongol invasion. Sometimes they do in some of the letters from the Pope to the King of Hungary. But in most cases, it kind of like this is already a trend that was starting in Europe before the invasion, and this is just also just a way to build a castle that's effective against anyone. If your castle is good against the Mongols, it's good against anyone who's going to be attacking it. But so the Mongol accounts, like I said, they emphasize the cavalry of the Kingdom of Hungary, but there's also a very widespread idea that the Mongols are terrified of crossbows. Which seems to be like of anything like the particular weapon where they thought, man, that's nifty. Like that European crossbow, I guess in the 13th century, its ability to puncture armor, whatever. Probably if we see at the Siege of Esztergom, for example, probably for guys trying to like bring scaling ladders to the walls, getting hit by these crossbows, they were probably kind of shocked by what they were capable of doing. And again, it's not that no one has crossbows in Asia. It's just that these particular crossbows, or maybe it's crossbows in general, this is also expressed in some accounts too, that crossbows in general they don't like, and the Europeans maybe had a slightly a higher number of crossbows. I would say, in my view, what we've seen for the most effective offense against the Mongols tended to be people who were also fighting as horse archers, but were better equipped horse archers. So this is what we see in the Mamluk Sultanate, in the Delhi Sultanate, briefly in the Jin dynasty before it's conquered, that these people who can field armies that are able to meet the Mongols head on and actually survive in the close encounters, but also do the skirmishing with archers and operate kind of in the field in a similar way that they can, those are the ones that had the most actual effectiveness in an offensive defense, right? So when the Mongols would come, for example, with the Mamluk Sultan would ride out from Cairo with his host and physically repel them and drive them back, similar in the Delhi Sultanate. And that's the most effective way to fight against them that I've seen in the accounts. So our European account or European version, there is no equivalent to that, and because they're not able to pin them down in the field, you might have these successful defenses of the hard points, but you're still letting them capture the prisoners and loot, which at a certain point, that's what they just decide to do anyways and get those people. Get out of it. And this starts early as 1285, and this continues through the Crimean Tartar raids over the next couple centuries. Right? And what good is your fortifications if you aren't actually protecting the people being assaulted here? In this case, right? I'm sure it made those villagers feel better that the king had a really impressive castle on the Danube, right? That so it's a give and take. What the king in our mythical scenario here, what the king of Hungary should have done is when the Cumans came in, got them really well equipped and sent them out to face the Mongols head on. Would have been more interesting, perhaps. But.
And I should be clear, I suppose, for the listeners that none of my trash talk online have I suggested that it would have been optimal or ideal, or should the Europeans have tried to take the warfare to the Mongols. That's not obviously not my contention that they should have tried to fight the Mongols on the steppe. I kind of view it as more of a porcupine and a coyote type of scenario. The porcupine is suited for when somebody's trying to bite him. And, the porcupine is not going to go out and attack a coyote. It doesn't really make any sense. So one other thing that I don't believe you had mentioned, I might have got this from the Weatherford book. No, I got it. I think it was actually from another YouTube video I was watching on the Mongol armies, where they were saying that for every Mongol nomad warrior, they would have had 5 horses, or roughly 5 horses to sort of cycle those out in the battle. And then of course, moving around and that sort of thing, which I feel like that's another factor at these, referring to the castles as these hard points. If you get sort of bogged down in a siege or anything like that, I guess I'm sort of speculating here, the animals sort of add to what is one of the prime dangers of a siege, which is disease. And so if you're sort of, as you mentioned, they want to get it over quickly, in part because they have all of these horses that need to eat, and they're obviously more comfortable sort of being more mobile, that if they get bogged down in these tougher sieges on these castles, that sort of increases the likelihood of disease. Does that seem reasonable?
I would say what we see from sources specific to the Mongol Empire and just medieval accounts in general, if you have a large body of men sitting outside of a castle for a long time, some sort of disease is going to spread among them. Animals or not, just because of human waste getting into water systems or some sort of epidemic or something. I don't think the animals are themselves that much of a factor, just because there's not really that many diseases that tend to jump from animal to human. And of course, you can have animals spoiling the water, of course, right? I would say if you have too many horses in one spot, you're overgrazing what you have, and you're going to need to keep going farther afield to keep finding feed for them. So when I discuss how nomads live in the steppe, nomads don't wander wherever they please. The steppe's not a no man's land. You're moving between dedicated summer and winter pastures. And you have to keep these separate and well organized, because if someone comes and eats your winter pastures, when you get there in winter, you're not going to have sufficient feed for your animals. And then your animals starve, and then you starve because you have no animals, or your animals become more susceptible to disease or something like this. So we don't get good descriptions of this. What we should probably assume when we have these lengthier Mongol sieges of locations, they don't tend to describe where specifically are the horses, but probably they have to kind of be managed and moved around if the siege is going on for a long time. And if you are just going through there quickly, you don't care as much because you're not stuck in that one spot. But if you have, say, our hypothetical, each Mongol has 5 horses. Now we know the actual number varied. Some guys have more, some guys have less. And probably what you see is your poorer guys are essentially renting horses from your more powerful guys who have thousands and thousands of them. So if you have even an army of 10,000, and each of them on average is 5 horses, that's 50,000 horses right there, not counting any other animals or sheep, goats. These are, I also keep in even larger numbers, but don't tend to be on the front line. They're normally kept a couple, some distance beyond the front line in sort of a fortified camp they travel with. All right. But you can't keep 50,000 horses in one field for a very long time. So this is, you're splitting up the force. You're having, some of these guys have to be spent to guard the horses too, right? And this is our other issue of if you're in a really densely fortified area, guys get an opportunity to sally out and attack these. And this is, like, the Mongols recognize this when they're attacking the Jin dynasty. One of the first things they go after is the imperial herds of horses. Like, these are the horses they're providing the army with. And the Mongols capture like all of these within the first 2 or 3 years of the war and deny the Jin dynasty most of its extra cavalry resources. So this is an important part of the warfare. And just briefly on this, the switching of the horses thing, we don't really have accounts of them switching horses in battle. It seems more like you switch them like one per day, and that one is then out of the rotation for a couple of days, so it gets a chance to rest, because Mongol steppe ponies are strong, but if you put a full guy in armor on them, you can approach like half of the way to the horse. So it's better to give it a chance to rest. So they're either changing the horse once a day or changing the horse before battle starts rather than in the middle of battle, because there doesn't really seem to be a logistically simple way to be doing that in the midst of battle. Like, how are you organizing the horses that, all right, this unit goes off, that's your unit of horses. Is that, are those horses already got tack on them? They have to take the tack off the horse they're currently on and switch on there. Like if you're trying to do that in battle, you're kind of keeping a lot of troops out of battle to be taking care of those things. And it seems that your army is trying to maneuver and stuff. If you have 40,000 horses right behind your army, that's not very convenient either. So probably there's some distance away, which some smaller part of the army is kind of guarding and corralling to keep them following the army. But they're close enough that when the army stops to rest, they can get them to do a convenient switch for the next day. Things like that. But again, if you're in more and more confined spaces with these hard points, these sort of maneuvers become more difficult. And these are things that evidently must be happening during the campaigns in China, in parts of Iran, the Caucasus, northern Syria. Like, right, these aren't uniquely European problems. These are problems that just our sources aren't happening to be drawing attention to. But this is the friction that, the more friction you give an army, the more you're going to make it harder to accomplish the goals it's setting out to do. So, and this is the idea behind layered castle defenses too. If you just have one gate, guys don't need to go through one gate. If you have 3 gates and they have to go through this path here and they have to go up a steep route here, and you're shooting at them the whole time, every step of the way is friction that's wearing them down. And this is what wears down Batu and Subadai's army from 1235 to 1241 before they go, look, we have to call it there. And your conquest, well, the conquest of China is exactly this too. The Mernke has these great plans for, like, okay, we're going to do like a 3-pronged assault run from the west. Kublai Khan conquers Tibet and Yunnan, so an army can attack China from the southwest, the Song dynasty from the southwest. Then you have a couple armies crossing the Yangtze, one going through Sichuan, and they think, all right, we'll have these 3 armies all together that are going to overwhelm the Song dynasty defenses. But because the Song resources and basically defensive depth is so deep, you can't have that kind of quick maneuver warfare and go, all right, we've captured these cities and we defeated these armies. The problem is the Song are fielding 100 more of all of these right away. And as soon as the Mongols withdraw, the Song recapture all of those sites that they lost. And this is what makes the Song warfare a very back and forth thing. So our hypothetical conquest of Europe is not going to be something probably completed in one campaign, if it gets completed at all. But what you would be looking at is probably waves of, okay, we conquered part of Austria this year, and this army got part of Eastern Germany, and then the next year we're going to meet in like the area of Bavaria or something like this, and then maybe they withdraw. Holy Roman Empire takes some of those back, and then they try this again, and they go, okay, let's try going through Italy this time. Maybe that's easier. Or let's try Bohemia this time, right? And you're you're prodding and poking and seeing what works until something works or until it doesn't. And again, same theme I've hit again and again here. To do all these things properly is requiring the political will and patience to mobilize the resources for that and to undertake that. The Golden Horde by itself does not have that. Even if it had the resources, I'm not sure it did, it doesn't have the political wherewithal. Like, it doesn't care enough about Europe to do that. For it wants to retake the Caucasus Mountain. It believes like Azerbaijan and stuff belongs to the Golden Horde and that the Ilkhanites stole it. So ideologically, it has a reason to try and take that back. What's the reason to send tens of thousands of men to potentially die in Hungary or Germany or something? It's right. The belief in world conquest will take you a long way, but it only goes so far if your world empire is kind of breaking up behind you.
And then I have one last question, and then I'll leave you with the last word. And it's probably a pretty brief one. You had mentioned at the very beginning, I believe, or maybe somewhere much earlier, about how they preferred a winter campaign season and then let the horses rest in the summer. Was that a normal thing, or was that for just that specific time? Because that's obviously the opposite of European conflict.
This is something that's been noted amongst nomadic armies going quite a ways back. This is something the Mongols do. Not every case, we have exceptions, but it seems all else being equal, this is generally their preferred way of operating. So that you start in September. So there's a couple of reasons, or not September specifically, but the autumn. You try and time it for the harvest season. So what you do is two things. If you come a little earlier, the harvest is still in the field. You destroy the harvest. You deny the enemy that bringing in the harvest. You do it after the harvest is brought in. You capture those settlements. Now you got the word they've collected the harvest, and you can feed your guys with that. Right? If you're campaigning through the winter, there's a couple of reasons this is preferable. Ground's harder. It's better on the hooves of the horses. Rivers freeze. You think they can cross frozen rivers. They famously do this with the rivers in the Rus, and this is how they get over the Danube River in 1241. All sorts of examples of that. Now, because Mongolia, very cold place, everyone has nice big winter coats, and the guys are pretty used to it. The horses can handle the winter very well. They put on extra good thick winter coats. So the troops themselves are able to withstand the cold of winter better than those of sedentary states, who they tend to see as these are kind of soft men, can't handle this. And we have a couple cases where they employ this specifically to their advantage. We have a battle against the Jin dynasty in February 1232, the Battle of Songfeng Mountain. And the Mongol forces kind of trapped on a hilltop, and this big blizzard comes through. And it's like coming down for 3 days or so, and they wait for those 3 days because they know by the end of it, or by the end of the storm, the Jin dynasty soldiers, who are mostly peasants and things from a bit further south, winters aren't extreme as they are in Mongolia. They're not used to those kind of conditions, and they're just in their tents and stuff, or out in the field, and they're cold. But the Mongols, they got their horses, they got their big coats, they're comfortable, they can handle it better. And they specifically say, we'll wait for them to weaken due to the climate or to the weather, and then we'll rush down and kill them when they've been weakened. And that's exactly what happens. So that's, of course, an element too. This is employed a lot in their campaigns in Central Asia and the Middle East because it's cooler, right? These are guys, again, from a cooler climate. Now, Mongolia can get fairly warm in the winter, but it's not that kind of intense heat you're going to see in northern Iraq or Syria, for example, or Palestine or the Sinai Peninsula. So what we see with the Mongol campaigns against the Mamluk Sultanate is They're going to try and aim for these cooler seasons when it's simply physically nicer to them. There's greater water resources, because if you go for the middle of July, the heat could be 40 degrees Celsius. The streams are dried up. There's no fodder for the horses. It's uh, like that's going to be murder for them if they tried to cross the Sinai Peninsula. So what looks like it happened in 1260, Hulagu withdraws, like I said, to Azerbaijan and was planning on coming back for winter 1260 when it would be somewhat milder to cross over the Sinai Peninsula into northern Egypt. And like I said, you want to rest the animals over the summer to get a chance to eat, fatten up. They have a bit of extra fat on them so that when they're being pushed hard over the campaign season, they can burn some of this off. And if there has to be a lean period, the animals are healthier and can better handle that. And same for the people too. The Mongols' favorite drink, and all nomads' favorite drink, is fermented mare's milk. So this is Erik in modern Mongolian. It's often known by its Turkic name Kunus. 13th century Mongols called it Isuk. So you can only produce this, though, when the mares are producing milk for their foals. So this has to be in the summer. So the guys don't want to miss out on that sweet, tasty mare's milk, nutritious and low alcoholic content. So it's also good for the morale of the guys. They kind of get this off season. We have sources saying things like when they're not fighting and when they're not hunting, the Mongol men, they're just sitting around and drinking and partying and having a good time. And I think if you have a bunch of guys, you want to keep their morale up for going to just be fighting constantly. You got to do things like this. So just mentally, physically, they can have a break, recuperate, and get kind of pumped up again to have another go at it. So, and because that's an uncomfortable campaigning season for your enemy, well, that's even better than for you. So, if you know there's not going to be like the Europeans are preferring to campaign in was it early summer, I think. So, if you know that's when troops are going to be mobilized, well, there's a lot of sense in not going when troops are mobilized or going to be prepared to be mobilized. But if you're going when they're wanting to be attending their fields, well, there's going to be a lot of reluctance for the Europeans to raise for the people who are going to be coming up to join those armies for the Europeans. Now, not everyone in the European armies is going to be a farmer. Obviously, most of them are, well, for lack of a better word, feudally raised troops. And Hungary think work a little differently, but keep it simple. These are guys who owe oaths of service. They have to provide some sort of military service or provide people in their stead to provide service. But of course, the economy and the cycles of life in 13th century, basically anywhere, are going to be tied to these sustenance networks. And if your sustenance networks means a certain part of the population has to be getting that food out of the field in September or August or October, and if they don't do it, there's mass starvation. That's not a small issue to overlook.
All right. Well, I want to thank you. It's been an incredible conversation. Very much appreciated. For everyone who's still listening, you can go check out his YouTube channel in the comments and various other links to get more information on the Mongols and read up and listen further on that. It's been a total pleasure. Very enlightening discussion. So thank you very much for that. And
thank you very much for having me.
And for those of you who have gotten this far, please let me know in the comments, could the Mongols have conquered Europe? And please feel free to leave us a review if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Leave a thumbs up, share it with a friend. And if you'd like to support my project in order to help me to create bigger and better content, please consider becoming a paid supporter on Substack. That's the home for everything Memory Medieval, and there's tons of free content there. In fact, everything I release so far is free, so you can become even just a free subscriber. Link will be in the description. I'll leave you with the last word. If you want to say anything else about the Mongols, about this, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be about the hypothetical. You could, if anything about the Mongols that, a last word for anybody, who's interested in the Mongols or enjoys the Mongols or anything else that you feel like you want to add to the discussion.
Well, I would just say that when you're studying, especially the Mongols, but any period in history, avoid the memeified version that you might find more comforting. The actual events that we get in our sources, our accounts, archaeology are much more interesting than the simple versions that you might feel more comfortable with. So to me, I'm much more interested in what the Mongols were actually doing. How did they actually conquer this? How did they actually conquer this huge thing? What is the empire actually like, right? You're used to all these people say, oh, it's just empty space. Well, it's not empty space. These are densely populated areas. There's people living all across the steppe. They're building cities in the steppe. They're ruling over like 80 million people in China. Like, this is so much more complex than just they're so badass and they ate more protein, so they're able to like, that's boring stuff. Give me the real juicy stuff. So what I try to do in my YouTube channel, Jackmeister Mongol History, what I do writing for others and I work for kings and generals in my articles and the monographs going forward, is really try and emphasize this. That this is history is more difficult, it's more complex, and it's more interesting because of it. So history doesn't fit into a TikTok video. That's why we've been here for almost 3 hours now. So, but thank you all for listening.